Completed abortion.
Why there is no fundamental right to abortion for the Supreme Court. By Arend Heinlein. On January 11, 2019, a 25-year-old asylum seeker from Afghanistan in Bad Kreuznach, Rhineland-Palatinate, visited his pregnant girlfriend, another 25-year-old Polish woman, in St. Marienwerth Hospital. An argument broke out in the hospital room, as a result of which the man stabbed the woman with a knife he had brought with him. He then fled the building. A patient who had witnessed the attack called for help using the emergency call button. The Polish woman underwent emergency surgery and was transferred to another hospital. The suspected perpetrator, who had come to Germany in 2015, went to the train station after leaving the hospital and handed himself into the federal police, who took him into custody. The life of the Polish woman, who had been living in a women's shelter in Bad Kreuznach for unknown reasons prior to her hospitalization, was saved. Her unborn child died from the injuries inflicted on its right leg and from the mother's severe blood loss. It later transpired that the perpetrator was the child's father. The Afghan was charged with attempted murder, grievous bodily harm, and completed abortion. While the chairwoman of the local Integration Advisory Board, Annette Bauer, dismissed the question of a connection between the man's cultural background and the cruelty of his crime with the general formula perpetrators are perpetrators in an interview with the Mainzer Allgemeine Zeitung, and even in the face of a morning rally, the AfD Bad Kreuznach expressed its sympathy for the mother who lost her baby, who was about to give birth, in a cruel way at the hands of an illegal asylum seeker. The AfD member of the state parliament Jürgen Klein combined this with the demand to replace the charge of completed abortion with killing a child in conjunction with attempted murder of the mother. In doing so, the AfD not only repeatedly took it upon itself to scandalize the consensual indifference towards violent crimes committed by Muslim migrants, but also used the crime as an argument against a liberal abortion law. The fact that the Afghan's crime is not classified as infanticide, but as a completed abortion, is not a deliberate trivialization of this particular act, but a consequence of the current legal situation. Termination of pregnancy is a crime against the developing life, which generally begins with the completion of nidation, i.e. between the 9th and 13th day after fertilization, and ends with the onset of the opening contractions during delivery. Cases of fetal homicide are divided into those carried out with the consent of the pregnant woman and those carried out against her will.
Absatz Sektion 218 para.
2 StGB provides for a custodial sentence of up to 5 years in particularly serious cases of fetal homicide. A particularly serious case exists if the perpetrator acts against the will of the pregnant woman or recklessly causes the risk of death or serious damage to the health of the pregnant woman. The last point is primarily aimed at abortions performed negligently and improperly, while the first concerns the unity of attempted murder of the mother and homicide of the fetus, which the AfD would like to have reformulated in order to blur the distinction between fetus and child. Although the proposal to replace the offense of killing the fetus with the different offense of killing the child, due to the cruelty of the Bad Kreuznach case, is obviously tactically motivated, this objection does not eliminate the disconcertment that the classification of crimes such as that of the Afghan as completed abortion spontaneously triggers. However, the formulation is not trivializing in principle. On the contrary, it contains a realization that neither empowering feminists nor self-declared pro-lifers like to think about. Every abortion must be based on a consideration of the rights of the unborn child and the mother. Where the weighing of rights is waived either in favor of the unborn child, who is the helpless victim of a killing by the mother, or in favor of the mother, who cannot kill an unborn child, either the responsible individual, who is the mother, is sacrificed to unborn life, or the unborn child, who is a future individual human being, is sacrificed to the arbitrariness of the born. Both opponents of abortion and propagandists of its complete legalization are disturbed by the convoluted wording of Section 218, which is interpreted either as an indication of the legislator's unacknowledged cronyism with the enemies of life to be or as a symptom of the criminalization of abortion without exception. In actual fact, the richness of the convolutions reflects an aporia that lies in the matter itself and could only be resolved through institutionalized bestiality. If a person only became a bearer of rights by being born, human rights per se would be subject to relativization. If only born life and not unborn life is a subject of rights, then arguments can just as easily be found for restricting the rights of life born with physical or mental disabilities, which is why it is not a lie of fundamentalist Catholics, but historical truth that there has always been an intimate affinity between abortion propaganda and euthanasia, culminating in National Socialism. The unborn child is therefore not an unborn something that becomes a someone as a born child, but must be regarded ethically and legally as a someone from the outset, albeit as a someone who grows up in the womb of another someone who is not only equally the bearer of human rights, but also of civil rights. The apparetic construction of abortion as an unlawful, but under certain conditions unpunishable act is not due to a disguised intention of the sovereign to somehow be able to punish women in the event of an abortion, but is the adequate legal codification of this contradiction. The fact that it allows doctors, fathers, and other people to exert pressure on women not to terminate a pregnancy, or, which also happens, but is less often discussed by feminists, to terminate it, does not take away the legitimacy of this construction. On the contrary, it places the woman as a responsible subject, from whom the weighing up of rights is not to be taken out of her hands by experts or other guardians, but is to be expected as the subject of an individual decision. The imposition itself is not moral blackmail, but a necessary consequence of the fact that the expectant human being is also a person, i.e., a legal subject. Pregnancy means that another person grows up in an individual human being who depends on that person by being different from him or her. This process of differentiation, the biological substrate of individuation, culminates in birth, but does not begin with it, just as it does not end with it. The fact that the human being in whom the other human being grows up is always a woman to this day testifies to the continuing entanglement of natural history and domination, which cannot be resolved by granting all rights to the expectant mother and none to the expectant human being. The individual provisions of the SDGB on abortion are reflections on these circumstances. The fact that an abortion is not punishable for the woman if she has it performed by a doctor within 12 weeks of conception after a consultation and 3-day reflection period, while the doctor may be liable to prosecution, which does not mean that he will be prosecuted, expresses the primacy of the protection of the expectant mother and the difference between the will of the woman and the duty of the doctor, who is not simply the patient's service provider. At the same time, the time limit solution is a reference to the progressive differentiation of the unborn child from the mother as the pregnancy develops. The fact that the duty to protect the fetus begins at the time of implantation of the fertilized egg in the uterine mucus is not a remnant of Christian superstition, but rather takes account of the fact that the idea of rights accruing to all human beings without distinction can only be justified in a consequent manner if human life is accorded genuine dignity from the outset. The duty to counsel and the reflection period do not in themselves imply unruly moral pressure, but are intended to give the expectant mother the place and time necessary for the weighing up of rights which it is reasonably assumed that every woman will carry out anyway before deciding to terminate a pregnancy, and, because the counseling includes medical information, also serve to protect the pregnant woman from arbitrary medical decisions. Medical and criminological indications, Section 218A2 and 3, protect the woman's right to physical self-determination, particularly in cases where the carrying to term of the child is forced against the will of the expectant mother or a criminal offense associated with the pregnancy threatens to be given less weight than the right of the unborn child. Discrimination, psychological pressure, and threats to which women who wish to have an abortion are exposed result from the inadequate implementation of this legal situation in the family and above all in the medical environment, not from the legal provisions themselves. Feminists in particular seem to notice less and less that these provisions are proof of civilization and legal equality in the face of a social situation in which completed abortion is practiced as revenge for disobedience while accepting the death of the mother, or in which women are forced to give birth to a child at the risk of their lives rather than being allowed to have an abortion. During a general debate of the Jusos, who demanded the deletion of Section 218 and Section 219, which regulates the obligation to consult, as well as the legalization of abortions beyond the 12th week without medical indication and without fixing a new deadline in a draft law at their federal Congress at the end of 2018. Some participants with medical knowledge raised the reasonable objection that a late-term abortion performed without medical indication at around the 6th month could, under certain circumstances, become an early birth, and the abortion could thus actually become a killing of the viable child. They were then called to their senses by another participant with the slogan that they were here at the Jusos and not at the Germany Day. The speaker, who identified herself as an incarnation of feminism by the inscription on her t-shirt, defamed the reflection on medical ethics as pathetic rhetoric that should be countered with offensive misanthropy. We have just been told that we have to stand up for something. Yes, for the living, for women, for their self-determination, and not for any unborn children. They simply have no rights beforehand, and human rights apply to women first, and then to everything else. According to this argument, which can be found less stupidly and less demagogically in almost all feminist pleas for the deletion of Section 218 without replacement, the unborn do not belong to the living, and therefore have no prior right. Women's rights, on the other hand, are not derived from human rights, but human rights are propagandistically misunderstood as group rights, in this case as women's rights, against which everything else should be set aside. However, human rights are based on the fact that they always apply to all others, who are symptomatically neglected here, just as the personal status of the unborn is contemptuously denied by shrinking them down to some, at best human-like entities. The common reference in such feminist circles to embryos as clumps of cells, even if it is used tactically to empower pregnant women in an emergency situation, promotes the tendency to deny expectant human beings the status of persons, which those who engage in such dehumanization of course permanently concede to themselves, without asking themselves when they became the person they consider themselves to be. The question of where exactly the boundary between before and after in the transition of human life from non-person to person should run at birth, at independent physical viability, a little earlier or a little later, cannot be answered in any other way than voluntaristically, which the Juso resolution has confirmed by leaving the determination of the boundary between the two to the arbitrariness of the respective women. In contrast, the social democratic medical experts, with their reference to the fluid transition between late-term abortion and the killing of premature babies, had drawn attention to the fact that ethical and legal philosophical considerations always and necessarily enter into every decision on whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, even where this is denied in favor of pragmatic silliness. The transition between late-term abortion and the killing of a premature birth reveals what applies to every abortion and is not only legally or medically assumed. In it, a person is killed whom secular civil law, in order to distinguish them from the child born, physically separated from the mother, calls a womb. The only way not to deny this scandal and yet to preserve and strengthen the woman's right to self-determination is to ensure that the pregnant woman weighs up her rights as uninfluenced as possible. Where this is denied, either because the unborn life, which is also always invoked in a de-individuated and objectified manner, is valued more highly than the living woman, or because the woman is hallucinated as the sole subject of the power of disposal over a something that has been reified into an object, human life is negotiated in the mode of contempt for life. As much as feminists are right in the face of a tribal Catholicism that is basically still rooted in natural religion and which, as in many Latin American and African countries, endeavors to bring unborn life into the world at the price of the literal sacrifice of women, the contempt with which the same feminists speak of any unborn is obviously directed not only against unborn life,
but also against born life.
The presumptuous assertion that any unborn is not so important because one stands on the side of the living mendaciously disregards this connection. In fact, only those who see the unborn, who every living person was once themselves, as a future born, i.e. a person, can show solidarity with the living. Contempt for the unborn is the flip side of contempt for born life. When German young career women today talk about a compulsion to give birth in view of the legal situation regarding abortion, this is not only a blatant trivialization of the situation in countries where women are actually forced to give birth at the cost of their own lives, which does not prevent the same countries from allowing the unborn to be killed in cases where pregnancy offends patriarchal or other cultural honor. Talk of compulsory childbearing also conceals the fact that the subsumption of women under the principle of wage labor, which was fought for by the women themselves, has just preceded the liberalization of abortion legislation in Western countries. Women in cultures in which children are the immediate guarantors of subsistence, i.e. food for their parents and the community to which they belong, are actually subject to a compulsion to give birth. Capitalist socialization and the bourgeois legislation in which it is reflected made possible for the first time in history the idea that no human being is ever merely the food of others, but has his purpose in himself. As the society that gave rise to this idea remained an unfree one, the immediate coercion was replaced by mediated constraints, which not only revolutionized the concept but also the reality of social rule. This is evidenced by the fact that in Western societies not only is there no coercion to give birth, but that, on the contrary, various economic and legal incentives are now being devised to encourage people to start a family. Just as such incentives do not imply a compulsion to have children, information and advice on family planning do not imply a ban on women having children at the wrong time in their careers. The repeated assertion that the pill, of all things, has promoted the adaptation of women to questionable role models by internalizing social constraints instead of contributing to their emancipation is a manifestation of such feminist camouflaged misogyny. The fact that a significant current of feminism in this country abhors contraceptive methods such as the pill or the IUD, which can be handled by the woman herself, regardless of possible health objections, as a means of self-manipulation in which the woman is made responsible for the risk management of her own fertility, while the lazy, chauvinistic man can concentrate on sexual pleasure, is not only disconcerting because in the case of abortion, the same feminists accuse male medicine of imposing an obligation to give birth on women. In the first case, men are accused of forcing the responsibility for contraception on women, in the second, of wresting the responsibility for the abortion decision from them. The argument that contraceptive methods used by women, unlike the pill proclaimed as desirable for men, serve female self-subjugation is idiotic in itself. By deciding when and how to use contraception, women acquire the power to decide how they want to deal with the possibility of having children, a self-empowerment that they would relinquish if they seriously relied on men swallowing their pill before having sex. What is rejected under the pretext of resistance to social manipulation is in fact the woman's responsibility for the biological possibilities given to her body. Instead, the responsibility is to be delegated entirely to men, who are supposed to deal with their ability to procreate in a reflective and sensitive manner, whereas women are only ever passive objects of procreation, so to speak. Representatives of 19th century gender biologism would have liked this attitude, as it turns men, in revocation of everything that women's rights activists have fought for over the centuries, into limitlessly potent self-procreators, for whose exuberant fertility the female body is merely the medium. In fact, procreation, as apparently no longer has to be explained only to children today, takes place between woman and man, both of whom are actively involved in it. The difference, however, is that it is the woman's body that bears the child, which is why the woman is more immediately affected by the decision on reproduction or contraception than the man, and should definitely take the pill away from him if he ever gets it. While feminist criticism of contraception imagines the woman as an unwilling object of the procreation carried out on her by the man, feminist campaigns for the legalization of abortion present women as the sole subjects of action, to whom doctors and judges should only be available as assistants. The fact that in the case of abortions, which affect not only the woman but also the unborn child, medicine and the law are and must be representatives of a general purpose that transcends the woman's will is systematically suppressed. The unacknowledged purpose is again the delegation of responsibility, instead of justifying the woman's right to decide for herself whether to have an abortion with her ability to weigh up her right against that of the unborn child. Any reminder of the necessity of such a weighing up is condemned as repression. Contrary to their institutional function, doctors and judges are seen only as extensions of the woman's will, not as instances of social mediation with which the woman has to deal. The low point of this rejection of personal responsibility is when the discomfort that all women feel when having an abortion is flippantly rationalized as a persuaded guilty conscience, as if such discomfort, as a reflection of the moral law, did not express the moral autonomy of the woman who decides to have an abortion. As certainly as not every abortion is traumatic for the woman, it is always an unsettling experience, because with the unborn child, something is erased from her own body. That was part of the woman, and yet not just part of her. The discomfort is not a reflex of patriarchal training, but rather something that resists the ideological training of feminism in women's self-relationship. The Bad Kreuznach case of the unborn child who was killed, the case of the Nigerian who almost decapitated his newborn child and executed the mother on Hamburg's Jungfernstieg, and many other crimes committed by migrants in recent years suggest that, in the course of Islamic migration, which has been largely promoted by Germany, European states will in future be confronted more drastically than ever before with executors of an understanding of law that not only does not recognize the concept of the person in civil law and its forms of mediation, but openly vilifies them and fights against them on the bodies of living people. The demands to change the criminal law on the occasion of the Bad Kreuznach case in such a way that the possibility of differentiating between the killing of the fetus and the killing of a child, which civil law has developed in order to define the concept of a person more precisely, is withdrawn, amount to adapting the law to the barbarism that it challenges. The bestiality of acts such as the one in Bad Kreuznach is not better punished by criminalizing all expectant mothers, whose appropriate decision for or against an abortion depends on the legislator's ability to differentiate between child and embryo, for the purpose of punishing such killings of the womb. At the same time, however, a feminism that speaks of the unborn as unworthy life, which only becomes valuable life at the moment of birth as if by a magic trick, makes itself common with an understanding of the law whose contempt for the unborn mirrors its contempt for the born. Civil law does not yet have sufficient means to punish crimes that bear witness to a culture in love with death, in which the compulsion to give birth and the total disposal of the community over the unborn actually converge, i.e. hatred of unborn and born life harmonize. However, the search for such means is doomed to failure from the outset, where the advocacy of women's rights is confused with hatred of the worthlessness of the unborn, which is not life but a lump. Islamically motivated acts of violence such as the one in Bad Kreuznach can only be perceived as collateral damage of a violent crime against women by such feminism, if it doesn't just use them as an opportunity to trivialize male violence anyway, instead of seeing them for what they are, an expression of an attitude that considers all un-Islamic life to be worthy of destruction, like the clumps of cells that feminists declare the unborn to be. If this indifferentism is then also sold as proof of a worldview that is not only feminist but also somehow communist, this is particularly hypocritical. For the free world society, however little can be said positively about it, would in any case be characterized by the fact that in it all the unborn could become born human beings without anyone, child, mother or anyone else, suffering as a result. In his lectures and notes of the 1960s, Max Horkheimer repeatedly dealt with the idea that the preservation of morality is important not only in the beginning, but also in the face of the threat to civilization in different variations. When he explores the similarities between revolutionaries and conservatives, it is because he sees productive criticism in the present as facing the problem that the dynamics of society have become so overwhelming for the individual that they can hardly be changed by any kind of criticism. Horkheimer reinforced these remarks, made in 1968 of all years, by attesting that the protest expressed itself in a relatively undifferentiated, largely uniform way. In the excessive need for action, he recognized a kind of overcompensation for the intellectual passivity that has been brought up, a tendency that has intensified with every protest movement since 1968. It was no coincidence that Horkheimer had already devoted an important radio lecture entitled The Future of Marriage in 1966 to an institution central to the development of bourgeois society, i.e., monogamy to the exclusion of incest. He considers this to be characteristic of modern Western civilization. The transition from the extended family to the nuclear family is only one moment in the spread of the lonely crowd, of solitude in the nationalized whole. Using utopian projections, which, as in Plato's Politeia, are reminiscent of a plan of the Third Reich and Huxley's or Orwell's caricatures of the future, Horkheimer shows that today's version of marriage appears to be as transient as it is relatively constant. What remains is the function of marriage in the changing social whole, whereby, with the progress of the Enlightenment, marriage becomes ever more clearly conscious as an instrument. Contrary to what utopians, idealists, and materialists expected, the contradiction between reason and bureaucracy would therefore not be overcome, but increasingly leveled out. For the Soviet Union, with its initially rather liberal view of marriage, when marriage, divorce, and abortions were formalized, Horkheimer argued that the weakening of the institution of marriage soon no longer matched its function in the totally mobilized state, which was not based on prosperity. The birth rate had declined, the neglect of youth increased alarmingly, the family as an educational cell became indispensable. He considers the role that socialist women were given in society to be central to this development, both as educators at home and as workers in the workplace. The fact that in the Soviet Union, as Horkheimer puts it, rule could largely rely on the stabilized, matriarchally organized marriage is still a supporting social element not only in Russia, but also in the post-Soviet states of Belarus and Ukraine, although the number of divorces increased significantly and the number of births decreased with the abolition of the total state. For Horkheimer, however, what is going on in China seems more important for the future of the West than what is happening in the Soviet Union. Even more than the change in the way of working, furthermore the strict collective education, the need to contain the enormous population growth exerts its influence. In fact, China's population has roughly doubled since 1966, when The Future of Marriage was written. In the mid-1960s, after the famine of 1959 to 1961, the average number of children born to a Chinese woman was around 6. In fact, the coercive measures imposed in the 1970s to reduce the birth rate, culminating in the one-child policy of 1979, have slowed population growth and reduced the birth rate to less than 2 children per woman since the early 1990s, so that the Chinese population has only been growing since then due to the significantly improved economic situation and the resulting increase in life expectancy. However, it was not until the drastic coronavirus measures were introduced that the one-child policy finally became a reality. While the birth rate had been relatively stable at around 1.5 since the 1990s, it fell to 1.3 in 2020 and to 1.15 the following year. 2021 was also the first year since the famine in which the Chinese population recorded virtually zero growth. Some demographers expect the population to start declining in 2022, which was actually not forecast until 2030. Without a trend reversal, China's population in 2100 could therefore be lower than it was in 1966. However, a mere continuation of the trend is just as unlikely as a rapid reversal. The relaxation since 2004, the introduction of a financially supported 2-child policy since 2016 and a 3-child policy since 2021 have in any case not had the desired effect in the short term. Instead, the trend towards later marriage and the ideal of my families that has been propagated for years is continuing. The development in China is not surprising insofar as what took place there under authoritarian coercion took place elsewhere solely through the mute compulsion of capitalization and the end of the agricultural sector. Previously, children were important workers for the cultivation of the land and also provided for old age, but since the integration of practically the entire adult population, including women and pensioners with high incomes, into production and services, they have become a cost factor that can be measured less in the cost of food than in the price of housing in the cities and in lost working hours. It should come as no surprise to anyone that people who have been confined to their shoebox apartments in Chinese megacities thanks to the zero-COVID craze have finally lost their appetite. In Europe, where at the beginning of the pandemic some experts were still ranting about a possible imminent baby boom, death rates were rising and birth rates were tending to stay the same, with birth rates and life expectancy continuing to fall in Eastern Europe in particular. As in China, a drastic decline in the European population can be expected over the next few decades. The only factor that can still compensate for this is migration, albeit in varying degrees, while in Scandinavia and the UK the working age population is even expected to increase over the next 40 years, with the birth rate and migration trends remaining roughly the same, and in Western Europe it is expected to remain almost the same. Demographers expect a decline of 10% in Germany and Austria. A decline of around 30% is even expected for Southern and Eastern Europe and over 40% in Southeastern Europe, as these are aging countries with net emigration, particularly of young people, to Central, Northern, and Western Europe. The fact that Europe is shrinking is compensated for in the economic centers by internal European migration and one-off effects such as the war in Ukraine, but is already clearly visible in the Balkans, for example, in places that are completely depopulated. The ideas of left-wing ecological movements, which revolve around the questions of how a constantly growing population can be fed and how the population bomb can be defused, have hardly changed since Horkheimer's time, although there can hardly be any talk of a globally growing population anymore. The slow increase in the world's population forecast by the United Nations and others until around 2080 is unlikely to be sustainable in view of developments in China and elsewhere. In fact, for some time now, the global population has no longer been growing through births, but only through increased life expectancy. Outside of Africa, the only continent with a birth rate well above 2 children per woman, it is beginning to shrink in more and more areas of the world, from Europe to America and Australia to Japan, Russia, and China. The ideology of the end of growth or of the last generation has its element of truth in that capitalist development, which has laid the technical foundations for feeding more and more people and generated productive forces that allow more and more people to share in growing prosperity, has itself set in motion the decline in birth rates that is bringing population growth to an end. It is questionable, however, what the answer will be to the reverse problem of an aging population claiming transfer payments such as pensions and care and ultimately shrinking, and how great the willingness will be to make more and more resources and manpower available to care for the elderly. China and its population policy, which is committed to the forced collective, has played a pioneering role in this not only since the coronavirus, but at the latest since Horkheimer's time. The fact that the period of individuality as an unreasonable one today is skipped to a certain extent, that friendship between individuals, measured in terms of the collective, is considered secondary. Furthermore, the pragmatism absorbed into flesh and blood, the pure thinking of purpose that is expressed in every word of Chinese leaders, all this is on the horizon of the West, no matter how hard one tries to look away from it.
End of quote.
It remains to be seen whether efforts alone are enough today. But if you look, for example, in Die Welt, you will find pragmatic power sentences like this one by chief reporter Anna Schneider: "Children are freedom killers." The text was prompted not only by Mother's Day, but also by a looming court ruling from the most important country in the Western world. At the beginning of May, the American constitutional judge Alito had to cancel all public appearances and the Supreme Court had to be cordoned off with fences and closely guarded. Numerous calls for violence against 6 of the 9 judges on the Supreme Court of the United States circulated on the internet. The reason for this was an unprecedented event, an internal projection by Justice Alito, which did not yet constitute a decision and should have remained internal according to standard procedure, was leaked to Politico magazine. The subject of the projection, which was incorporated into the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision on June 24, was the overturning of the January 1973 Roe versus Wade ruling, which guaranteed all American women a right to an abortion. According to conservative legal opinion, which has a majority of 6 votes to 3 in the current composition of the court, it is up to the legislature to regulate this. The fact that the internal projection has already been leaked to the press can only be explained by the fact that a mob contemptuous of the independence of the judiciary was to be set in motion in order to put pressure on and intimidate the judges in question. The extent of the furor can only be understood if one is familiar with the Roe versus Wade decision, how it came about and its significance for abortion rights in the United States, as well as the escalating dispute over Supreme Court appointments and between the various schools of law since 2016. Few in the German media, which almost exclusively at least implied that arch-conservative, fundamental religious judges had banned abortion, provided a sober view. Prior to 1973, there was no more codified, liberal abortion law in the entire United States than there is today or at any time in the past 50 years. Throughout, it was a legal issue decided at the state level, with prohibitions, regulations, and requirements for abortion varying by region. In the year that the Supreme Court handed down the landmark Roe versus Wade decision, abortion was already legal under certain circumstances in states such as Colorado, Hawaii, New York, Washington, and California, while in others it was banned outright. A pregnant woman under the pseudonym Jane Roe had filed a lawsuit against the district attorney Henry Wade against such a ban in Texas. The Supreme Court ruled that there is a right to abortion. The court derived this from the right to privacy, which is read into the so-called Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, among other things. According to this clause, A state may not interfere with a person's life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
End of quote.
This derivation has always been controversial among jurists of all political camps and schools of law because it does not speak positive law, but creates judge-made law and thus contradicts the separation of powers, according to which this clearly falls within the jurisdiction of the legislative power legitimized by general elections. The very invention of the right to abortion from a right to privacy already constructed from the Constitution makes Roe v. Wade a miscarriage of justice that was legally required to be overturned. In addition to the extremely weak legal reasoning, the moral considerations of the ruling are also difficult to understand and, as Christian and Thomas Funk point out, clearly contradict those of the German Federal Constitutional Court, which in its two rulings on abortion takes the view that everyone, and not just every person after birth, has the right to life and that the state must protect this right. Quote, abortion must therefore be regarded as fundamentally wrong for the entire duration of the pregnancy and must therefore be legally prohibited. However, abortion is permitted or even required in situations in which it is unreasonable to continue the pregnancy, indication. In addition, it is possible for the legislator to focus on counseling pregnant women in the early stages of pregnancy and to dispense with the threat of punishment.
End of quote.
These understandable considerations led to the result that, although abortions are generally prohibited in Germany, they remain exempt from punishment until the 14th week after counseling has taken place. Exceptions to the ban are also provided for in the case of medical and criminological indications, e.g., danger to the mother, no or low viability of the fetus, rape, incest. A right to abortion does not exist, but provided that the legislature decides this and adheres to the relevant law, access to safe abortion is guaranteed without declaring unborn life, which for the Federal Constitutional Court understandably begins with nidation, to be a disposable product in the early stages of pregnancy, even if its worthiness of protection increases with the duration of the pregnancy. At least the latter was also taken into account in Roe v. Wade. The ruling assumed 3 trimesters of pregnancy, with abortion only being prohibited in the third. The judges did not commit themselves to a definition of when human life begins, but absurdly assumed that unborn children have no right to life, as they are not yet persons within the meaning of the law. Any balancing between the protection of unborn life and the rights of the mother is missing, and the point in time that should mark the end of any right to abortion, viability outside the womb, was declared in the equally flawed subsequent decision Planned Parenthood v. Casey, 1992, to be the point in time until which it had to be allowed in any case. The U.S. Supreme Court justices thus struck down a right to abortion invented by previous justices and sent the issue back to state legislatures, where it belonged, in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The specific case concerned a law in the state of Mississippi that provided for a ban on abortion after the 15th week, i.e., roughly equivalent to German practice, and was illegal according to the case law in force up to that point. All 6 conservative judges voted against the lawsuit and in favor of allowing the law to stand, with 5 of them voting to overturn the Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey rulings. This means that the states are now free to formulate their own abortion laws, with the exception of endangering the life of the mother, but without any restrictions, for example in cases of incest or rape, in which a continuation of the pregnancy would be unreasonable under German law. In a number of countries, particularly in the Deep South, very far-reaching abortion bans have since come into force, for example from the 6th week of pregnancy. However, this does not go far enough for many radical opponents of abortion, as around 2/3 of abortions have so far been carried out before the 8th week of pregnancy. As this so-called heartbeat rule is still not enough to make abortions de facto impossible, a total ban on abortion now applies in 12 states including Texas. Until recently, the entire United States had one of the most liberal abortion laws in the world, but in many states the pendulum has completely swung back, creating a patchwork that disregards women's rights and ends any legal certainty for abortion doctors and clinics. In Texas, doctors who perform abortions can not only be prosecuted, but can also be sued by private individuals. Since the fundamental issues were not resolved politically between 1973 and today, and Roe v. Wade prevented a sensible compromise that meaningfully weighed up the right to life against the rights of the mother, 2 camps are irreconcilably opposed to each other, operating under the labels pro-choice and pro-life. Even in these self-attributions may lie a major reason for the recent debacle of the proponents of a nationwide right to abortion, for when it comes to whether one sees life or an ever-dubious freedom of choice as the more important goal, the answer is obvious. Everyone knows that the decision to deprive a developing human being of the opportunity to live, even if it is with other people, if one finds oneself unable to care, points to the status of the living within society. Not being pro-life means, as a consequence, putting every life up for discussion. On the other hand, the flattest liberalism, expressed in slogans such as "my body, my choice," "my belly is mine," or "children are freedom killers," completely misses the point. If we assume that most abortions are caused by the fear of social relegation, social ostracism, of being alone with a child, or even just the concern of no longer being able to pursue one's profession and preferred leisure activities unhindered, then we simply cannot speak of a free decision in the affirmative sense, but as critics who see themselves as left-wing or even materialistic. We should place such conditions at the center of our considerations. Moreover, it is of little help to trivialize or completely devalue unborn life in the face of the fact that abortions are often followed by a twinge of conscience, which also gives ammunition to the fundamental opposing position that wants to see every abortion punishable by law. In order to achieve a socially acceptable compromise that guarantees the right to abortion, it is not at all necessary to make such far-reaching demands or to negate the right to life for the unborn, as the example of Germany is not the only one to show. The pro-choice stance itself is proving to be a problem here. Although the vast majority of Americans are in favor of a right to abortion in principle, their anti-life positions make the political implementation of such a right difficult at federal level and make it impossible in some states. Increasingly, however, one gets the impression that such political efforts are hardly an issue anyway. The Supreme Court has made a legally correct decision within the scope of its powers, thus contradicting the growing tendency in the Western world, from Israel to the EU to the USA, to appoint Supreme Courts as super-legislators, especially in the event that the democratic process leads to undesirable results. The dispute over its appointment, which in the US is by presidential nomination and Senate confirmation for life, is so interesting precisely because, broadly speaking, the conservative school of law wants to grant the legislature and executive wide-ranging powers within their political mandate, while the liberal school is in favor of reigning in the legislature, keeping the government on a leash and, in case of doubt, making law itself through an expansive interpretation of the Constitution. That does not find a majority in parliaments. It is therefore clear that a political occupation of the Supreme Court only threatens the principles of the Constitution and the separation of powers in one direction. Liberal majorities are prepared to make regulations for all states and without any specific law, whereas conservative majorities refer questions to the parliaments and concentrate on protecting the rights actually enshrined in the Constitution. The political dispute over appointments to the court came to a head in 2016, when the prominent conservative judge Antonin Scalia died unexpectedly and Obama failed to get his candidate Merrick Garland through the then Republican majority Senate, so that after Trump's election, the conservative judge Neil Gorsuch was nominated and a liberal majority on the court was prevented. When the bipartisan and esteemed Anthony Kennedy retired in 2018, Trump was given another opportunity to nominate a judge to the Supreme Court in Brett Kavanaugh, which the Democrats unsuccessfully tried to prevent through an unprecedented mudslinging, including unproven rape allegations. The majority in the Supreme Court finally tipped in the conservative direction when the liberal icon Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in 2020 and Trump was able to nominate a third conservative judge, Amy Coney Barrett, in his final year in office. The Democrats protested and demanded that Trump renounce the nomination to which he was constitutionally entitled. However, because all presidents in a comparable situation had still made nominations in the last year of their term of office, Obama just 4 years previously, a research assistant was commissioned to search the internet to find out when a president had waived this right. They found what they were looking for only 160 years ago, and at least with an important president like Abraham Lincoln. Kamala Harris commented on this in the vice presidential candidates debate on October 7, 2020. Quote, Abraham Lincoln was up for re-election in 1864 and there were 27 days until the election. And a seat on the United States Supreme Court was open. Lincoln's party controlled not only the White House, but also the Senate. But the honest Abbés said it was not right to do so. The American people deserve to make the decision about who will be the next president of the United States. And then that person gets to choose who will serve a lifetime on our country's highest court.
End quote.
Aside from the embarrassment of addressing Lincoln as Honest Abe, everything about the whole story is untrue. First, no such or similar quote from Lincoln has been documented, passed down, or even circulated. Second, the seat only became vacant 27 days before the election, and the next session week was after the election, in which, third, a close associate of Lincoln was nominated and confirmed on the first day without waiting to be sworn in again. Fourth, there is no indication that this would not have happened if Lincoln had lost the election. However, she had ignored the real question posed by Vice President Pence, because the Democrats realized that their influence on the Supreme Court and the ability to enforce quasi-laws through it was increasingly dwindling. The call for court packing is becoming fashionable. The Supreme Court should simply no longer have 9 judges in future, but 12 or even more, and conveniently, President Biden could make all the additional nominations. Harris hinted at how she could justify this in the debate, sidestepping the question. Trump had nominated too few black judges to the courts and they needed to become more diverse. While Biden has rejected the court packing process since the election because it could trigger a constitutional crisis, he has made identity politics the only recognizable project of his presidency. As with the position of vice president, only a black woman was considered for the position of Supreme Court judge, which means that Biden excluded 93% of the population from the outset. This step is serious insofar as political considerations always play a role in the selection of suitable candidates for an office, in which origin, age, gender, and in the USA, race also play a role, for example in the nomination of the black judge Clarence Thomas by George H.W. Bush, who was considered particularly conservative, but by proclaiming, in the spirit of identity politics, that only a black woman would even be considered, Kamala Harris, for example, was seen as the most readily available, best-known female black emergency nail, rather than the best possible candidate for the vice presidency, and has been treated accordingly within the government since her election. And when Biden was allowed to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court this year because the liberal judge Stephen Breyer was retiring, he nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson, which did nothing to change the majority in the court, but promptly prompted criticism that the court had been given a worse black woman instead of a particularly high-profile, politically progressive lawyer of Indian descent. The fact that the question of what even constitutes a woman is now mine to reign does not necessarily make the fight for women's rights any easier. After information leaked about an impending overturn of Roe v. Wade, the American Civil Liberties Union tweeted a list of the groups most affected by abortion bans, which omitted women but mentioned ethnic minorities and people of color, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, young people and those working for necessities, and people with disabilities. Just as the campaign for abortion rights is now devoid of women, political protest is increasingly a mere simulacrum. This became particularly clear on July 19, when several members of Congress practiced civil disobedience in front of the Supreme Court. They did not, however, accuse themselves of having had an abortion in Arkansas or Oklahoma, i.e. of deliberately violating a wrongful law, as the term implies, but merely blocked traffic in the manner of Extinction Rebellion and were taken away by the police for doing so. In addition to the legalist Islamists Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez unsurprisingly also took part in the action, grinning at the cameras with her hands clasped behind her back as if she had been handcuffed. In the way she generates attention and presents herself as virtuous, this new type of politician has now completely assimilated media celebrities such as Meghan Markle in terms of her appearance, clothing, demeanor, and progressive wordplay. Work in committees or well-founded legislative initiatives are not to be expected, but a battle for clicks and attention, always combined with appeals for election donations. The workings of the institutions and the fundamental principles of the separation of powers, on the other hand, are completely alien to her. Due to a decision that does not suit them politically, the Democratic wing around Omar, Tlaib and Ocasio-Cortez is now seriously claiming that the Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy and is thus putting on a show that is in no way inferior to Trump's and his supporters' contempt for political and constitutional procedures after Biden's election, insofar as they deliver undesirable results. Apart from the Roe v. Wade miscarriage of justice and the lack of political and parliamentary compromise, however, the most important reason for the polarization on the abortion issue is probably the completely different visions of the future. While progressive politicians, Black Lives Matter and academic books and articles celebrate and ideologically double down on the increasing loss of importance of the nuclear family because it is the source of patriarchy and racism, the same development is blamed in conservative circles for a loss of values, crime and brutalization, the disintegration of the society in which one grows up. In this way, both sides confirm what Horkheimer prognostically described as a dynamic of social decay in late capitalism as early as 1966 in The Future of Marriage. A bridge leads to the old civilization, the pillars of which are becoming ever weaker. The lack of illusion, the blatant realism, the absence of the dream associated with a person mean both coldness and the tendency to react to sexual and related impulses with little differentiation. Insofar as religion is experienced, rightly or wrongly, as merely conventional, pure convention, it is impossible to understand why violence and cruelty are not respectable pleasures, apart from the police and the penal code. However, the idea of the immortal soul of the individual, which once formed the basis of respect for one's neighbor and belief in one's own destiny, has lost its power among the majority of young people. My idea of the future of marriage is thus already indicated. However long its civil forms may last, the consciousness of the unique union, the meaning of the name, the will of those united in it to shape the life that is their own and, if at all possible, to continue it through their children, is fading.
End quote.
People who, like American Christians, still try to hold on to such things rightly appear to the liberal, be he European or American, who is dominated by expediency, as eternally stubborn, reactionary, out of date. They ask questions such as what a society propagates that holds the right to abortion so highly, despite all the possibilities for contraception, that progressive corporations such as Amazon, which are widely known for their love of workers' rights and trade unions, finance abortions for their employees but do not grant parental leave beyond the legal minimum. They ask whether, when you are old and sick, the company is at your bedside or still there for the employee when they make the wrong comment on Twitter and are subjected to a shitstorm. Whether it can be right to place babies in standardized institutions just a few weeks after birth so that they can sit in an open plan office for hours on end, or whether the promotion to chief reporter or head of controlling in a local division of a corporation can actually be something like the meaning of life. Presented in such a defeatist manner, such questions may cause disruptions to business operations, but they remain superficial in their criticism. However, hatred of a society that treats mothers badly, in which parents have no time for children and fathers say goodbye altogether, of people who affirm abortion but want to see borders torn open against demographic change, for whom people are seen as mere dispositives, would be the prerequisite for getting there at some point. Fundamentally, the sexual revolution, the pill and the right to abortion have meant that sexuality and bonding have become two increasingly separate things and the responsibility for a pregnancy lies solely with the woman. However, the undeniable advantages of this, which no sensible person would ever want to fall behind, are not the only reason for the growing dissatisfaction of many women with the inconsequential sexual availability without commitment that is demanded of them. The sexual liberation propagated under these auspices is now tending to turn into a liberation from partnership, and even from sex altogether. The proportion of incels and singles is steadily increasing, as is the consumption of internet pornography. Among today's 20 to 30-year-olds, no demographic group has better career prospects than women from good homes who remain childless or at least find a partner who is equally involved in the care and support of the child, even beyond the existence of a joint family. On the other hand, they encounter a society in which poor women in particular are themselves to blame if they become pregnant or even have children and therefore have to see how they manage. For them in particular, the patriarchy that has finally been overcome with the disappearance of fathers does not mean liberation, but rather being on their own either from the outset or over the course of the next few years, failing to achieve social advancement and, in case of doubt, being dependent on social welfare. In the United States, this means that more than a third of children do not live with both parents and more than a quarter grow up with only their mother, with the proportion being significantly higher in the lower classes. It has been known for decades that the misery is also passed on here, that the majority of suicides, runaways and homeless people with behavioral problems, violent people who run amok, drug addicts etc. come from this group. However, this problem will certainly not be solved simply by propagating family structures that no longer objectively exist or by including fathers who may themselves be violent, indifferent or otherwise have behavioral problems. Since a more comprehensive response would be expensive and its success uncertain, the propagation of abortion rights for poor women by left liberal social planners of the upper and middle classes always has the unpleasant connotation that what is really being blabbed here is that the reproduction of the déclassé is primarily seen as a dysgenic factor to be contained at all costs. The liberation of women, as we know it today, follows from their integration into the labor market. However, mothers and fathers who work little or not at all and spend more time with their children are at the greatest risk of poverty and fall behind in the competition for the best jobs. In economic terms, children are a mere cost factor, while society is increasingly propagating the idea that family, strong bonds and responsibility are less important and that it is better to do without such freedom killers. The conflict over the abortion issue and the reintroduction of strict abortion bans are a social backlash directed against a rather dystopian progress that increasingly calls into question the social value of life, which is unsuitable or an obstacle to immediate exploitation. In contrast to Chinese authoritarianism, whose demographic suicide would only be the most consequent realization of its policy aimed at the nullity of the individual and which can be trusted at any time to get rid of a surplus of useless old age in the same way as unwanted daughters, the importance of individuality was central to the West. It was usually conveyed and passed on within the family and beyond the institutions and repositories, which schools in particular have degenerated into, where education has long since ceased to have a chance. When, at the end of his reflections in the future of marriage, Horkheimer rightly refers to the enormous evils produced by the tyranny of men in the entrenched bourgeois family, he expresses the concluding and unspecified expectation that the yield of life in the future will be attributed far more to other constellations than to marriage. The answers to the questions of what these should be and how something like generativity can still exist at all under the erosion of marriage and family, when the only remaining alternative socialization instances are the ideological state apparatuses and the permanent propaganda of the culture industry, cannot be particularly optimistic. The loss of importance of marriage and family and the associated gain in equality make the distinction between men and women increasingly obsolete. Among those most vocal in the United States against the Supreme Court and in favor of abortion are hijab wearers, queer feminists and other reliable enemies of civil society and women's rights in particular. In their self-righteous virtue signaling, They only care about the marginalized and déclassés at best as momentum for their own importance and means for their desired goal of finally destroying the nuclear family as the nucleus of the hated white, bourgeois society. Horkheimer would certainly be astonished to find that the utopian alternative models on offer today have not progressed a jot beyond Plato's Politeia. In her book Full Surrogacy Now, Sophie Lewis, for example, calls for the principle of surrogacy, in which a mostly poor woman carries the genetic child of a rich woman, to be generalized in such a way that everyone becomes a surrogate mother in a child communism. She is just one of numerous authors who, on their way to a parentless society, declare the abolition of the family to be the ultimate goal, which is already happening at an ever faster pace. 4-0 COVID fanatic Binny Adamchak, everything was already heading towards a solution in the total state without privacy in 2017. Quote, if children are raised by large democratic and anti-authoritarian institutions, food is no longer prepared in small kitchens but in public canteens, the elderly and sick are no longer cared for by so-called relatives and home cleaning is no longer organized privately, then the family is completely superfluous.
End of quote.
The fact that people like Adamchak find it much easier to have total access to other people's children than anti-abortionists, and that their vision of a better society sounds suspiciously like a reformatory and detention center for delinquents, difficult to educate children or senior citizens is not least due to their understanding of an anti-authoritarian upbringing, which we should know is predestined to turn into an authoritarian nightmare at any time. Women who do not benefit from the end of the family, who are forced to have abortions because of their need and are criminalized for it in various U.S. states, who are not liberated from the decline of social mores and conventions, are abandoned by a left whose self-reflection, expressed in formal slogans, merely stabilizes conditions. For Marx's critique, in whose tradition critical theory stands, it has always been clear that the talk of preserving the bourgeois patriarchal family, which still comes easily to conservative pro-lifers today, fails to recognize the class character of the family. Quote, what is the present bourgeois family based on?
On Kapital, on private Akquisition.
Fully developed, it exists only for the bourgeoisie, but it finds its complement in the enforced family-lessness of the proletarians and public prostitution. The bourgeois sayings about family and education, about the intimate relationship between parents and children, become all the more disgusting the more, as a result of the great industry, all family ties are torn apart for the proletarians and the children are transformed into simple articles of trade and instruments of labor.
End quote.
The bourgeois family falls prey to criticism because capitalism is recognized as the destructive force that tears apart workers' families, throwing them back on themselves. It is precisely this process in its current postmodern form, the conditioning of people for lifelong service to the utilization of their productive power, which economizes social relationships, that is affirmed today and even propagated as liberation from patriarchy. The degradation of children to disposable or, in the sense of surrogacy, to commodities is already a threat to civilization. Over 600,000 abortions in 2019 in the wealthy USA speak for themselves. The fact that, according to the mothers, around 60% of these were carried out due to poverty or the threat of poverty cannot simply be an expression of freedom of choice or moral depravity in the sense of contempt for life, but is due to false conditions that need to be abolished. The conviction that childlessness, particularly on the part of women, is due to the biological or economic impossibility of having children rather than a conscious decision, does not appear to be a mere relic from times when the nuclear family was considered the ultimate purpose of every partnership. The research team led by Claudia Ronfeld, a professor of social work at the Gera Eisenach Cooperative State University, seemed rather surprised when a study they conducted in the fall of 2022 came to the conclusion that most of the women surveyed explained childlessness as the result of a free decision rather than external constraints. Until now, we have assumed in research that the general conditions are to blame for women deciding not to have children, Ronfeld told MDR. However, the survey showed that childlessness was mainly explained by respondents intrapersonally, i.e., by their own wishes. There is a great awareness that children take up a lot of space, time, and energy, explained Ronfeld, suggesting that the results of the study can be interpreted as a symptom of a tendency towards the primacy of self-realization and individual freedom. At the same time, the study diagnoses that many childless people are confronted with prejudices due to their supposed selfishness. This confirms that the decision to remain childless is still perceived as a deviation from the norm, despite changes in living conditions. To contradict the assertion that childless people are selfish, you don't need to go as far as the publicist Sarah Deal, who in her latest book Die Freiheit, Alien zu sein, The Freedom to be Alone, paints an equally abstruse distorted picture of single women's lives for the purpose of encouraging them. In Deal's book, the single woman, especially the one who decides against motherhood, appears as a pitiful outcast who constantly has to struggle with the impositions of a majority society that is supposedly obsessed with family happiness and nesting. Single women, Deal suggests, are often afraid to leave their homes alone in the evening to go to the movies, for example, not so much because they are afraid of sexual assault, but because they have not been taught that a woman who goes out in public alone should not be ashamed of it. According to Deal, most Western women have also internalized the stereotype of motherhood as a female destiny to such an extent that the mere thought of contraception, let alone abortion, makes them feel guilty. In truth, Deal's image of single women designed for the feminist empowerment of single women corresponds just as little to reality as the hateful image of their selfishness. Rather, both distorted images articulate the same authoritarian need for a nanny state that caringly besieges its citizens and is just as intolerant of individualistic deviations as it is of attempts to preserve a remnant of privacy. The family-friendly despisers of single people, who for their part have long since ceased to belong to the petty or Philistine bourgeoisie, but to the postmodern green digital bourgeoisie, are ultimately fighting in the alleged selfishness of singles nothing other than Deal with her pathos of self-empowerment, which addresses single women as potential victims who must be regularly patted on the back so that they can get through life well. Both attitudes are characterized by a gesture of being permanently annoyed and offended, which perceives people who are different from oneself primarily as obstacles. Accordingly, the representatives of both positions prefer to express their views in a passive-aggressive tone that signals from the outset that the speaker feels they are in the right. The groundless belief that one is in the right is based less on judgment than on the conviction that by being who one is already making an indispensable contribution to civil society that must be rewarded with gratuities. The fact that its defenders are not concerned with individual needs but with the contribution to civil society is also a key to understanding the post-bourgeois family. Significantly, the green affine milieu, consisting largely of freelancers, academics and cultural workers, in which contempt for single people is often expressed, hardly differs from the target group of Deal's book. Like Deal, the post-bourgeois apologists for the family are supporters of diversity, inclusion, gender-equitable education, gender language, and flat hierarchies. They have as few objections to youth climate activism as Deal does, and most of them are likely to agree with Deal's earlier comments on the legalization of abortion, the status of the unborn as a clump of cells rather than a legal subject, and the persistence of patriarchy in Western societies. If they have nevertheless decided to have children and complain about the selfishness of single people and the lack of social appreciation of their child-rearing achievements, it is not because the post-bourgeois family friends have a life plan that differs from Deal and other apparent individualists, but because they seek to live out very similar life plans within the family. Basically, those who see their family as a civil society project secretly despise children just as much as they disapprove of single people. The green affine post-bourgeois milieu is only tolerant of children as long as they can be functionalized as a reflection of their own life plan, which is increasingly losing the character of adulthood as a result. The gender and climate-sensitive child, who declares eco-conscious nutrition to be as much a matter of course in elementary school as gender fluidity and sustainability, and who, during the pandemic, seems to be just as willing and committed to compulsory masks and class vaccination as their parents, is hardly supposed to be anything other than the physical expression of the views, beliefs and gestures that their parents have instilled in them in terms of their views, achievements and everyday
behavior.
At the same time, by leveling the maturity gap between children and adults, which bourgeois upbringing still presupposed as a condition for successful individuation, parents put themselves at eye level with their offspring in everyday practice. This kind of parenting practice also tends to turn the children into the partners that the parents, who misunderstand each other as a team, want to see them as. The conflict-laden antagonism between adult and child, which post-bourgeois pedagogy abhors as a symptom of outdated authoritarianism, is leveled out. The always painful detachment from parents, accompanied by conflict, anger and grief, which was constitutive of the concept of maturity in bourgeois society, is replaced by a rotten compromise between the generations. The pseudo-integration of children and parents into a civil society conceived as a multi-generational house, which knows neither conflict nor reconciliation, but only consensus. Against this background, it is hardly surprising that the same parents who, during the coronavirus years, dismissed any reference to the psychosomatic damage caused by compulsory masks and social isolation by saying that children in particular can cope with a lot, are now just as defiantly complaining about the wave of various viral diseases that have been favored by the weakening of children's immune defenses caused by the measures. Parents who do not perceive their children as future adults who are opposed to their own wishes, but rather as outsourcings and extensions of these wishes, this perception becomes concrete in the tendency to transport their offspring on trailers with cargo bikes, are disturbed by child-damaging behavior, especially when it is perceived as a violation of their own principles. It would be short-sighted to accuse such parents of selfishness by reversing their resentment towards single parents. In truth, they treat each other no more as individuals than they do their children. Egoistic parenthood would consist of giving priority to the purposeless and thus to self-indulgence in the relationship with a partner as well as with the children, instead of subjecting them to a concept of civil partnership that is selfless in the worst sense. It is one of the ingrained habits of left-wingers to proclaim opinions that are guaranteed to win majority support in a pathetic tone of voice, as if they were breaking taboos. One of the most popular of these socio-critical hit pieces is the polemic against the so-called bourgeois patriarchal nuclear family. Almost no one who attacks it is able to say what exactly defines it, what distinguishes it constitutionally from other forms of family, and where it still exists today. The objection that the bourgeoisie itself put an end to the patriarchy from which it sprang, at the latest with the introduction of women's suffrage, or at least contributed to the erosion of patriarchal forms of socialization, is regularly countered by pointing to the notorious structures in which patriarchy lives on despite formal equality and freedom, even in bourgeois democracies. Whether the nuclear family as an agent of individuation might not also have advantages over the pre-bourgeois extended family, as well as in comparison with post-bourgeois patchwork communities, is a question to which left-wingers are all the more unable to find an answer because they have internalized the equation of bourgeoisie, patriarchy, family and fascism that has been handed down since Wilhelm Reich, even if they are not even familiar with his study, the mass psychology of fascism. Today, when even leftists can no longer really believe in the triad of bourgeoisie, patriarchy and fascism, after all, it is the flexibilized, still unfree conditions themselves that make the nuclear family, where it still exists in rudimentary form, appear to be an obstructive anachronism. Other rhetorical means are needed to give conformist criticism the appearance of dissidence. Sarah Deal illustrates in her book The Freedom to Be Alone how easy it is to replace the set pieces of historical materialism with elements of a jargon of self-awareness and inwardness in resentful criticism, provided there is a greater demand for the latter. Deal's previous journalistic work, which focused on defending the right to abortion, was already characterized by an ambiguity in her judgment of the relationship between reactionary and progressive moments in bourgeois society. Her 2007 anthology Deproduction, a documentation of the debates on abortion in the 20th century, was based on the thesis that the regulation of abortion was necessary for maintaining the production and reproduction relations of bourgeois societies, and that the appropriation of decision-making power over abortions by women was therefore a contribution to deproduction. An act potentially critical of capitalism. Deal's 2008 documentary Abortion Democracy used the example of women from Poland seeking abortions in Germany and South Africa, where abortion legislation is more liberal than in Poland but women lack medical information, to show how differently bourgeois states approach the regulation of abortion law. The fact that it was the bourgeois legal system itself that made the protests of the Second Women's Movement against Section 218, against mandatory counseling in the run-up to abortions, and against the contradictory relationship between impunity and criminal liability for abortions possible in the first place is an aporia that Deal's earlier works already tended to ignore. Since her book Die Nicht Tickt, The Clock That Doesn't Tick, published in 2014, she has resolved the aporia insofar as the social address of her writing has become increasingly clear. Even though it deals with socially marginalized groups, structurally generated poverty among women and the connection between reproduction and exploitation, it is primarily aimed at left-wing freelancers, whose ideological self-understanding and private miseries Deal hypostatizes as symptoms of crises in society as a whole. While in Die Nicht Tickt she already stylized the contradiction between the desire to have children and career planning, between work, privacy and the public sphere, the overcoming of which is a substantial part of self-realization in the perception of many women from Deal's generation and social milieu, as a general theme for all women, in Die Freiheit, Alien zu sein, an encouragement for single women to discover the productive dimensions of loneliness. She goes one step further in translating economic terms into existential, self-discovery metaphors. In fact, Deal's book consists almost entirely of attempts to avoid describing its subject. This is unfortunate, because it is not simply a life counseling invention that there is a taboo on loneliness. However, this taboo does not consist of loneliness being an enemy of meritocracy in a similar way to laziness, as Deal attempts to explain at the beginning in his reference to the critique of work in Hannah Arendt's study Vita Activa. On the contrary, loneliness as a form of reflection of atomized and thus insubstantial individuality is a necessary prerequisite and an agent of bourgeois socialization. The difference between loneliness and solitude, which Deal himself takes up, is able to illustrate this. Throughout the bourgeois epoch, solitude has not only been a complementary concept to loneliness because, as Deal believes, in contrast to the negativity of loneliness, it aims at transcendence and is thus a fulfilling experience. Rather, solitude, exemplified in Nietzsche's philosophy, is characterized by a trait of heroism that loneliness, which denotes an experience of privation, lacks. A sentence by Else Lasker-Schuler from her 1912 novel My Heart, "I am so alone, if I were at least solitary, then I could write about it," sums up this difference. In the era of the bourgeoisie, loneliness is a name for solitude reinterpreted as substantiality, for authentically standing up to one's own emptiness, the experience of which is no longer accepted or suffered, but rather achieved, giving loneliness a nimbus that does not belong to being alone. Insofar as the affirmation of the formal character of individuality, the self-consideration of the individual as the fungible role-bearer, as defined by the functionalist role sociology of Irving Goffman or Talcott Parson, is a prerequisite for the normal execution of bourgeois socialization. Loneliness, which is ideologized and substantialized in solitude, is not the enemy but the driving force of what Deal calls meritocracy. However, because loneliness lacks the idealistic surplus that the successfully isolated call solitude, it refers atomized individuals to the hopeless randomness of their social existence. In this side of loneliness, in the unattached and therefore unbound nature of loneliness, there is indeed a quality that could enable insight and criticism. However, it is precisely this side of loneliness, which also promises to provide insights into women's experiences of being alone, that Deal does not address. Her sole endeavor is to reinterpret the socially conformist and role-compatible side of loneliness in the sense of feminist empowerment as a subversive potential for experience. While The Clock That Doesn't Tick was about the happiness of childlessness rather than the economic, legal, and psychosocial conditions under which childless women live in Western societies, The Freedom to Be Alone is about positive feelings rather than contradictory experiences. Quote, "In the microcosm of subjectivity, the importance of loneliness for the development of creativity and other abilities is revealed. The capacity for loneliness is related to the capacity for relationship and attachment. Both have their own times and places. Both must be consciously sought and practiced in balance. Loneliness is fundamentally an important part of self-care, as it promotes a more pronounced ability to be in community. With a new relationship that immediately follows on from the old one, you compromise the attempt at independent self-love that you are currently working hard to regain.
Age holds immense potential for new freedom.
You have soaked up so much life and life experience that you can now quite happily enjoy some quiet time alone."
End quote.
Wherever you open Deal's book, you get the impression that you are holding a life guide for humanities scholars at risk of precarization. The atrophy of any socio-historical and socio-psychological interest in questions of self-coaching, empowerment, and extended career counseling indicates the disintegration of the subject matter that Deal ostensibly deals with. Because loneliness has become the social fate of all and the isolated individuals must deny themselves insight into the constitutive conditions of such isolation if they want to survive economically, but because at the same time any cooperation of individuals in the sense of an interest that can be seen as reasonable and that would converge with the enlightened self-interest of individuals is blocked, the post-bourgeois monads neither flee into hypertrophic individualism nor back into the family unit. On the contrary, individualism as an elbow mentality is just as hateful to them as family and partnership, whose natural growth they have long since seen through as ideology. For them, the only alternative to traditional forms of individualism and care is the sect, in which the delusional tendencies of both individualism and the cult of community merge. Deal's vapid rhetoric of encouragement, which confuses autosuggestion with judgment, appeals to the need for the sect. This corresponds to a language that evokes nothing but community when talking about loneliness, the community of female friends and interlocutors, from whose statements Deal, instead of using them as a basis for social theoretical reflection, draws keywords to reinforce her predetermined opinion, the community of female authors from Virginia Woolf to Alice Walker, whose commonalities are not hermeneutically inferred, but derived from shared gender affiliation. Finally, the community of female readers, which apparently consists of only two groups, those who agree with Deal anyway, and those whom she has yet to win over. If her book nevertheless gives expression to loneliness, it is through such an addiction to harmony, such a longing for community and unity. Anyone who constantly believes they have to encourage themselves and others to be alone must be pretty despondent. Anyone who invokes self-love is thereby implicitly speaking of the loss of the possibility of object love, and anyone who concludes a book about loneliness with the sentence, "When I am alone, the whole world is with me," is desperately trying to exorcise the experience of privation that announces itself in loneliness so as not to have to reflect on it. Deal also does a disservice to those women whose rights she has championed in earlier works by transforming criticism into a sentimentally padded world interior politics reminiscent of Rainer Maria Rilke. For Germans, it seems, sin can only be imagined as a stale après-ski fantasy. What the Lolita myth was for America, the schoolgirl report was here in Germany. The abysses of ecstasy were revealed to the mass audience with a preference for the view of snow-white alpine landscapes in films such as Jagdrevier der Scharfen Gemsen, Hunting Ground of the Sharp Chamois. Instead of erotic thrillers, people watched sex education films, and the vacant double position of de Sade and Justine was filled for life by Oswald Kohl and Beat-Us. Ingrid Steger was considered a sex bomb on German television, and Horst Tappert let his pants down in the pedagogically valuable soft pornos from the time of sexual liberation. It was here that classicists from Winckelmann to Weinken, inspired by Platonic eros, strove for the beautiful body, here that progressive social scientists invented the word sexual hygiene, and only here that the genre of pornographic entertainment film is almost entirely located in the haze of school, sport, and home. When it comes to being overwhelmed by lust, which every aspiring young woman has to pass just as early as the state examination, the smooth deflowering by the sports or piano teacher is the obvious choice, while the mother and housewife may encounter the tempting stranger in the form of the plumber or fitness trainer. German eroticism would probably be a promising title for the shortest movie in the world. Anyone who has followed the press reports in which the reformist Hessian-Odenwald school has been portrayed as a pedagogical Sodom and Gomorrah in recent months following the revelation of various cases of abuse, most of which are time-barred, is reminded of German sex education porn from the 1960s and 1970s. Teachers assigned sexual service providers for the weekend, reported Der Spiegel on March 6 and lamented the years of abusive wards at the UNESCO model school, after former pupils reported that they had been regularly woken up by having their genitals fondled, supplied with drugs and alcohol, and forced to have oral sex. At the same time, the Frankfurter Rundschau published a report about a former pupil whom two teachers had shared as a playmate, and quoted an alumnus as saying that there was a veritable anti-bourgeois hysteria at the Odenwald school. It was very permissive there all those years. In the same month, the author, TV presenter and former Odenwald school pupil Amelie Fried also confessed that she had been defamed as an uptight Swabian Philistin for any resistance to the prescribed permissiveness, and was allowed to pour her memories of abuse into a lyrical prose piece entitled Die Rettende Halle, The Hell That Saves, for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung on March 14. In it, she waxes lyrical about living with peers and education for courage, but at the same time paints a horrifying picture of everyday life together in the Odenwald for any down-to-earth house father, with surprise visits from teachers in the group shower room, forced strip poker rounds, and the hand under the comforter as a morning wake-up call for boys. A scenario that was completed in May by the news that a music teacher in Odenwald, who has since died and can therefore unfortunately no longer be prosecuted, forced his charges to perform sexual acts in front of the camera, and abused some of them up to 200 times, Süddeutsche Zeitung, May 2, 2010. Amelie Fried, who still has not a single critical word to say about the concept of reform pedagogy as such in its humanitarian view of humanity, also interprets the cases of abuse at the Odenwaldschule primarily as a particularly irresponsible form of abuse of authority and laments the corruption of her once stable pedagogical ego ideal. When she bawls out the then Principal Gerald Becker in a tone of sensitive consternation, namely ducking and accusing at the same time, was what you taught us at the Odenwaldschule meant seriously? Not to avoid conflicts. Stand up for others.
Be courageux.
Then don't avoid conflicts.
Be courageux.
Apologize and ask your victims for forgiveness.
End of quote.
Gerald Becker's reaction was limited to a lukewarm apology for any advances, while his partner, the notorious pedagogue of the Hartmut von Hentig, replied in Fried-compatible corniness that the real problem was not so much sexual assault as the fact that a cold modern society looked suspiciously at any tenderness and, in its panicked fear of transcendence, erected protective measures against the shy god. Becker himself died in July after a long illness, but before that he was able to witness the therapeutic measures his alumni used to try and overcome their traumatic experiences. On April 19, in an article with the astonishingly lurid title Morgens früh um 6. Early in the morning at 6. Which makes tabloid journalism seem almost sympathetic, the Süddeutsche newspaper announced with relief that finally the victims were finding a language and a voice to express and publicize the drastic acts of that time, and could begin their morning work. Quote, at an exhibition opened in Heppenheim to mark the school's anniversary, graduates have now dressed up their experiences in nursery rhymes. In the Odenwald, no testicle stays cold. As part of an art installation, they sing from the tape, early in the morning at 6, there's sex first. Early in the morning at 7, it's done again. Assault at 11, goes on until 12. Even in school days, Thomas Backelmann, who is now the director of the theater in Kassel, reported at a panel discussion, the Biecker, he thinks boys are yummy.
End of quote.
What the German Central Organ for Victim Protection interprets as morning work completed with drastic words, which is the appropriate response to drastic deeds, is in reality, not coincidentally, more reminiscent of the uptight attempts at self-disinhibition by refractory Boy Scouts, who, in the course of the emerging youth movement around 1900, first celebrated the convergence of hostility to pleasure and the cult of fun, unacknowledged prudery and authority-seeking taboo-breaking that was to come into its own a little later in the German Volksgemeinschaft, which was not simply hostile to the body. The jokes with which the alumni process their sexual humiliations and whose mixture of homophobia, callous prim humor and collective resentment has nothing to do with the individuality and intimacy of mourning, because it only appeals to the consensus of the community, differ from the tawdry sex games that are said to have been practiced in the Odenwald, just as little as the hollow heart-building pathos in the statements of the accuser Amelie Fried and the defender Hartmut von Hentig. The verses are not nursery rhymes at all, for that they lack both naivety and profundity, but rather a variant of the Fartenschange with which the youth movement life reformers of the early 20th century used to celebrate their, albeit mostly imaginary, brutal health. Rhyming the testicles with the Odenwald and sex with 6 in the morning mocks the actual helplessness in the face of unwanted sexual touch, just as it denounces any reminder of the possibility that sex at 6 in the morning could also mean something other than rawness. Instead of reproaching their teachers for the fact that the reality of life in the Reform Pedagogical Laboratory, as Paul Gehebe, founder of the Odenwald School, called his educational institution, made a mockery of the promise of free sexuality, this reality is used to denounce the promise itself. In truth, such morning work follows the logic according to which it only takes sufficient sophistication and self-hardening to assert oneself as a powerful member of a virile puberty collective in a milieu in which everyone is a pig of character anyway, who is allowed to let off steam with his own humiliation in the hunt against the authority derided as soft, the Becker who finds boys delicious. Such authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, which finds its appropriate expression in a mixture of self-pathos, power-mongering and salaciousness, is already inherent in the ideology of the reform pedagogues themselves. The alliance of inhibition and longing for disinhibition, which not only characterizes the sexual lewdness of the Odenwald teachers, but also the obsessions of their critics today, can be exemplified by a prominent pupil at the boarding school, who was already Hessian champion in javelin throwing at the age of 15, was a successful sports pilot during the Nazi era, became Germany's first female stunt pilot, founded the first German erotic mail order company shortly after the end of the war, opened a specialist store for marital hygiene in 1962 and invented functional lingerie, Bedas, the Leni Riefenstahl of the sexual revolution. She exemplifies the culturally Protestant understanding of free sexuality, which from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, was used primarily in Germany and Scandinavia against the refinement and coquetry of French eroticism, which was perceived as a symptom of decadence, but also against the inauthentic superficial body image of the girls imported from America. If the girl, who could become a mass cultural icon for a time in the Weimar Republic in the course of the new objectivity, represented the casual sportification of one's own body and the casual adaptation by the new women of social forms of intercourse formerly perceived as masculine, as they were to be found in everyday reality, especially among female employees, the French. Eroticism stood for the reconciliation of sexuality and freedom of purpose, instinctual nature and luxury, as well as for the promise of happiness, always perceived as threatening in Germany, that the stylization of one's own body through fashion and cosmetics could help sensual nature to become aware of itself instead of leaving it at the mercy of civilizational alienation. Nordic sex, which Bedas patented as a successful model and whose origins can be found in the body and life-hostile body cult of the youth movement and its reform pedagogical offshoots, is directed against both manifestations of the happy mediation of civilization and drive. This free sexuality, which has not for nothing been predominantly defined in terms of medicine, physical training and public health, denotes the unleashed but unenlightened drive, whose complete and blind satisfaction of needs, because it can only be obtained at the price of equally complete self-mutilation, turns into destruction, in which the demands of society and the individual, civilization and drive are equally betrayed. It is therefore not a contradiction, but rather consequent, that a woman who has dedicated half her life to the transformation of sport into physical agony has succeeded for the first time in making lingerie and sex toys accessible to German popular consumption. The cult of sport, which was also characteristic of the girl cult of the Weimar Republic, has a different meaning in its Anglo-American variant than in its German one. The cult of sport in Americanism was, at least ideally, always also a model of civilization. Fair play and sportsmanship still have a double meaning there today as sport-specific and social terms that denote the individual's ability to achieve successful intersubjectivity, i.e. the ability to assert one's own interests precisely by recognizing the interests of the other person and by incorporating the moment of convention into one's own behavior. This claim has become sedimented in the casual smoothness of Anglo-American sportiness. The German cult of sport, on the other hand, implies an ideal of heroic self-constraint of the body, which is to be put in a position through strict bondage to ruthlessly and brutally assert its own needs, which in turn cannot be experienced in any other way than as ruthless and brutal. Clothing that intensifies the sensuality of the body through piquancy and refinement is fundamentally alien to such an understanding of the body and should actually be rejected as a source of luxury and effeminacy. It took a fighter pilot trained in life reform to speak of hygiene instead of lust, to Aryanize lingerie into sexy lingerie, and to belong to the anti-Catholic Humanist Union, which is still one of the most important advocates of reform pedagogy in Germany today, in order to use the purposelessness of eroticism to optimize a hygienic sex life. This is the German version of Sexual permissiveness from the Odenwald to Commune I. The naked body, which Reform pedagogy celebrates as a dress of light, and makes the focus of its pedagogical aesthetic preparations, is a desexualized body without desire, pleasure, and pain. While the expressionists played off the raw speechlessness of the body, in whose convulsions and cries the true humanity of the creature manifests itself, against a process of civilization perceived as catastrophic, aestheticism and Jugendstil, whose most important socio-political programs included the youth movement and Reform pedagogy, created the ideal of a body that could no longer be thought of as an expression of either pleasure or pain, because interiority and surface, pleasure and social body were always supposed to be harmoniously united in it. The metaphor of the naked body as a dress of light sums this up. By fetishizing nudity itself as the natural and therefore sacred dress of all human children, it denounces both nudity and dress, and thus the process of civilization itself, which produced both in their specific relationship to each other in the first place. Nudity as such, regardless of its opposition, is not the natural dress of man, which has been spoiled by the corrupting influences of civilization, but crude nature, not yet conscious of itself, as raw as it is potentially at the mercy of every crudeness. And the dress is not simply functional protection, and thus is a useful means of survival itself owed to natural compulsion not simply concealment of the body, but rather at the latest since it became fashionable, always puts the body at envelopes on display as a sensual body. Nudity as a form of intimacy and clothing as a mode of seduction were first created in the course of the civilization process as specific forms of expression of individuality. Anyone who wants to return to nudity as the original dress of the originally beautiful human being is also declaring war on this process. Norbert Elias, whose writings have been completely eradicated from the academic canon by the social sciences, which have been converted into cultural studies, was well aware of this. His concept of civilization, which deciphers the fetishization of culture from the life reformers to National Socialism ex negativo as a path to barbarism, is perhaps the last defense of civilizational compulsion as a way out of the natural compulsion that the concept of culture affirms as the actual nature of human beings. The term culture has always been used in an inflationary manner in the context of Reform pedagogy. In keeping with the tone of today's Protestant educational politicians, the early 20th century was already praising the culture of learning and culture of conversation, calling for cultural reforms or inaugurating a culture of the child, Ellen Key, and a youth culture movement, Gustav Weinken. The Reform pedagogical variant of free sexuality was consequent free body culture, in the name of which the exorcism of sex from the human body was practiced. Like the image of the light dress, the term free body culture suggests that the human body can only come into its own in its authenticity when it has finally shed the last traces of civilizational decadence with its clothing, be it civil or decorative. The free body that remains in the end, however, is not a subject of pleasurable sensual experience, but shrinks into a mere carrier of a culture that liquidates the individual and its sensuality in order to resurrect the beautiful body in its place, which is just as unaware of the contradiction between social structure and instinctual structure, the particular and the general, as it is of the socially mediated antagonism of masculinity and femininity, the forced harmonization of which is celebrated as androgyny. The products of the life-reforming cult of beauty are correspondingly repulsive. If the desexualized, de-individualized youths in the paintings of the life-reform artist and proto-fascist Fidus alias Hugo Reinhold Hoppener represent a nudity that, completely frozen into an ornament and symbol of itself, lacks any concrete corporeality, conversely the clothing designed by the life reformers, their unadorned and contourless linen sacks and unisex rags that are still popular today, lack any autonomy of the aesthetic. While clothing tends to be reduced to a body container, the individual body regresses to a mere specimen of a physicality praised as the incarnation of the pure human. The nudist excesses now being reported from the Odenwald also seem to have focused on the compulsion to transform the individual body into a de-individualized free body. It was not the lewd sex games of the Odenwald people themselves that were denounced as uptight, but all those who did not feel like communal nude showers and nude bathing or touching each other in a sticky, friendly way. Even the strip poker, apparently the most modern undressing ritual in the Odenwald, is not about the seductive oscillation between closeness and distance, but about getting rid of one's own clothes as quickly as possible to group applause, which are not intended to increase pleasure in the body, but act as body wrapping that has to be torn off as soon as the party begins. The point of nudism is that all those who practice it, and it is always a collective behavior, hardly behave any differently when they are naked than when they are dressed. This is precisely why there is nothing more unerotic than a nudist beach, where the laws regarding assaultive behavior and consent regulation are at least as strict as at an anti-sexist gender camp. This is why intimacy is excluded from the outset in the Reform pedagogical world. After all, intimacy and individual pleasure are inextricably linked, while maintaining the desexualized nudity regime requires the constant presence of friendly glances to prevent the excesses that can only take place in isolation from the group. It is precisely this need for individuality that is denigrated by the reformist educational community, even in its most rudimentary manifestations, as a sign of uptightness. The relaxed physicality that is propagated in contrast to this is a mere euphemism for the expulsion of sex from the body in the name of nudity, which means nothing other than the neutralized, sexually deprived body that can actually expose itself to the gaze of the community without fear, because there is nothing left that is its own. It is this repressive lack of tension that distinguishes cultural Protestant reform pedagogy particularly unpleasantly from the more sensual Catholicism, which has been discovered in recent months with rare media unanimity as a hotbed of abuse, mistreatment, and child abuse. While the abuse cases at the Odenwald School were almost universally interpreted as a kind of aberration in which teachers had irresponsibly abused their authority, child abuse and maltreatment are just as uniformly understood in reporting on the Catholic Church as symptoms of a genuine problem with Catholicism. Reform educators, according to this view, since even good-hearted people are not immune to going astray, can become child abusers in certain cases, but Catholics somehow always have
been.
It is no coincidence that members of the Humanist Union, a civil rights organization that sees itself as secular and is closely linked to the Reform pedagogical movement and in which, in addition to Hartmut von Hentig, Sabine Luthius-Schnarrenberger, Renate Kunist, Claudia Roth and other politicians from the libertarian and eco-left spectrum are also involved, have been prominent in the campaign to expose the connection between Catholicism, sexual hostility, and abuse. In addition to Beat-Us, Helmut Gollwitzer used to be a member of the association. A curious pedophilia rivalry has developed in recent months between the Humanist Union, in which almost exclusively Protestants and atheists are organized, and the Catholic Church, while Regensburg Bishop Gerhard Ludwig Müller accuses the association, whose members include apologists for the de-demonization of pedophilia such as sexologist Rudiger Lottmann, author of the book Die Lust am Kind of Decriminalizing Pedophilia and Trivializing Pornography. Cultural Protestants denounce Catholicism's hostility towards the body, consider themselves the guardians of a humane sexuality, and in the best tradition of Reform education, cite nudist pictures of children as examples of harmless depictions of nudity, as if the repressive aspect of Reform education's nudist culture were not rooted precisely in this assumed understanding of harmlessness. The measures that public opinion recommends to Catholicism in order to prevent future cases of abuse follow a cultural Protestant tradition. Healthy sexual and marital hygiene, it is suggested, could be the first step towards the resocialization of sexually neglected priests. First, celibacy should be abolished, which prohibits Catholic men from adequately discharging their sexual urges within marriage. Then homosexual desire should be allowed, so that it is not acted out on innocent boys, and finally a freer culture of conversation about sexuality and physicality in general should be established, as has long been practiced in Protestantism. The uptight, backwoods bachelors of Catholicism are contrasted with the relaxed, enlightened nature boys of cultural Protestantism, a figure of thought that could have been taken directly from Beat-Us' erotic accessories trade. However unsympathetic the sexual morals of the Catholic Church may be, anyone who thinks they can accuse it of uptightness from the perspective of healthy sexual hygiene is revealing themselves as a denouncer from the outset. The image that Catholicism paints of the body as a source of pleasure is, in contrast to Reform pedagogy, neither desexualized nor harmonious, but extremely effect-laden and contradictory. The Manichaeism of Catholic dogmatism, which Protestantism not unjustly rejected as archaic, its juxtaposition of pure soul and rejected body, sin and redemption, Virgin Mary and witch etc. together with its iconography, has never been merely an expression of the perhorrescence of body and sensuality in the name of the purity of the soul, but captures, unconsciously but inexorably, the experience of irreconcilability and the painful necessity of failure in an antagonistic reality. The countless, sometimes seemingly absurd forms of mediation that Catholicism has developed over the centuries in order to exorcise the demons of sex prove it right through the energy expended on it to an extent that its church could only admit at the price of self-abandonment. The Catholic aesthetic, which revels in the representation of what is frowned upon and gives expression in the Eucharist to the ever-broken longing that the symbol may truly be the thing to which it refers, instead of merely sanctioning its absence and thus the collective renunciation, is a single invocation of the this-worldliness of lust in the awareness of its impossibility. In every sacrament, grief over the disappointed hope of the profane resurrection of the flesh is celebrated. In the cultural Protestantism of Reform pedagogy, there is neither contradiction nor pain, neither irreconcilability nor mourning. While the aesthetics and architecture of Catholic church buildings are entirely geared towards emphasizing the qualitative boundary that separates them from the unsatisfactory and sober sphere of the profane, Protestant church buildings are usually an expression of the effort to merge as completely and unobtrusively as possible into this unsatisfactory sobriety. This is why they often resemble gymnasiums or tenements rather than the gates of heaven. The affirmation of poor immanence, which is expressed in this inner worldliness of Protestantism, usually praised as a transcendence of the archaic elements of Catholicism, also characterizes the Reformed pedagogical image of the body. Prototypical of this is the idea of the natural harmlessness of sexuality, which also dominates the abuse debate as a good human resentment. Healthy sexuality, it is assumed, is actually beautiful, tender, free of fear and violence, which is why the transformation of sexuality into violence, as it occurs in abuse, is basically anti-sexual. Sex must be protected from the violence that abuses it. The term sexualized violence, which is commonly used on the left, sums up this nonsense by describing a violence that basically has nothing to do with sexuality, but merely expresses itself in it and is therefore only somehow sexualized when it is carried out. But just as sexual pleasure cannot do without the moment of aggression, of overpowering each other, which becomes pleasure in intimate consent, rape is simply an act of violence to which sexuality is merely added. Rather, sexuality and aggression have always been intertwined throughout the history of civilization, and it took a complicated mediation process, threatened by many setbacks and still precarious today, before the idea of a sexuality could even emerge that aims at the happy self-cancellation of aggressive impulses in jointly experienced pleasure. Indeed, sexual pleasure is basically nothing other than the always fragile, but sometimes successful mediation of those antagonistic impulses. While the Manichaeism of pure soul and rejected body in Catholicism drastically holds on to this contradiction and seeks to exorcise it at the expense of the body, in Protestantism it is seen as always already harmonized, but thus turned all the more brutally inwards. Catholicism follows a morality of externalization. The antagonism of soul and body is externalized in the sacrament, and sin can be discharged in confession without further persecuting the sinner. Protestantism follows an ethic of internalization. For it, life is a sequence of good and bad deeds, which are constantly offset against each other by the accounting system of conscience. Consequently, it replaces ritual cleansing with ethical self-hygiene as a service to the community. This is why Protestantism, especially in its reformist variety, has no understanding for excessive sexual suffering or excessive sexual pleasure, which Catholicism seeks to express in ritual, asceticism, or mystical ecstasy, however questionable. While the sensual body is the problem of Catholicism, around which all rituals from the Eucharist to the cult of the Virgin Mary are centered, it is not a problem at all in cultural Protestantism. At the Odenwaldschule, as at state schools, there were never any regular sex education lessons, not because, as a Catholic might argue, this would tarnish the sanctity of the body, but because, as Gerald Becker openly proclaimed, it was quite simply unnecessary. The biological information that was taught there was not remotely as important as the opportunity to experience one's own fears and pleasures as something that can be said and understood, which is why informal discussion groups had to take the place of learning-oriented lessons. Since one's own body as it is, as the natural dress of light of all people, is supposed to be the answer to all questions, it seems to be an expression of cold-hearted, instrumental thinking to claim that in order to experience sexual happiness or to provide it for others, one must first know certain facts and learn techniques. Too much knowledge is just as harmful to Platonic eros as too much speculation. In the Reformed pedagogical cult of the body, hatred of civilization and hatred of transcendence converge. The double contempt for empirical reality and transcendental longing paradoxically expresses itself in the Reformed pedagogical community in a penetrating invocation of all unity, reconciliation, and harmony. What the mass public dislikes about Catholicism, the awareness of the coercion and violence required to unite divergent interests and needs under the umbrella of the one church, plays just as little a role in the public perception of Reformed pedagogy as it does in the humanitarian self-image of its protagonists. While the law of the Church is omnipresent in the images and gestures of Catholicism and in the complex hierarchy of its internal organization, which resembles a secret society for a reason, Reformed pedagogy does everything it can to erase the traces of domination that it is and to establish a comprehensive negative equality of its members, from the group organization to the dress code, from the cleaning plan to nutritional and sexual behavior. The Catholic dress and symbolic order actually recognizes the individuals who are subject to it only as bearers of a certain function, as determined by Catholic dogma. In this respect, it is anti-individualistic. At the same time, however, it is more individual-friendly than Reformed pedagogy because it does not concern the whole person, but only the person as a believer, as such, however, completely and utterly. The merciless regimentation that Catholicism imposes on its followers, which can easily be exposed as an expression of arrogance, autocratism, and inhumanity, stems precisely from the claim to establish and maintain a solely valid law in its own sphere, which cannot simply coexist alongside state sovereignty in mutual toleration, but is antagonistically and conflictually related to it. Institutions such as celibacy or confession are an expression of the attempt to mediate between ecclesiastical and profane law without denying this contradiction, but thus always also a sign of the impossibility of the two spheres merging completely. It is precisely this complete merging that Protestantism elevates to its actual ethical program, as the integrity of faith is not primarily demonstrated in the correctness of adherence to formal rules and rituals, but in the everyday work and life of each individual. The rituals and regulations, whose fetishization in the eyes of most contemporaries reveals the anachronistic character of Catholicism particularly clearly. Just think of the importance of Church Latin or the practice of replacing the civil names of popes with the names of saints, are rejected by more modern Protestantism as an expression of an outdated, external compulsion and replaced by an internalization that liquidates the moment of individualization, which is undoubtedly also imminent to it at the same time. After all, internalization in Protestantism, as is evident in its cruelest manifestation, pietism, does not mean the liberation of the individual from the external coercion of dogmatism, but rather the annulment of the leeway that its outwardness sometimes left the individual, in favor of a total identity of individual and community, which even encompasses the sphere of sleep, dreams, and fantasy. Only against this background can we understand the repressive core of Reform pedagogy's contempt for convention, often misunderstood as a sign of modernity, which links it to National Socialism, which was also a genuinely anti-traditionalist movement. In their mockery of the immovable authorities that had to be swept away in the name of youth, joie de vivre and blind dynamism, the protagonists of the youth movement hardly sounded any different from the H.J. pimps who would later refer to them. And in their muddled approach to the unresolved antagonisms of sex, which seeks to rationalize all forms of expression of shame, shyness, despondency or fear by invoking the one healthy sexuality that unites all, the inhuman lack of tension that is characteristic of the authoritarian character, who excuses every vulgarity because nothing human is alien to him. As well as the left-wing progressive sex educator who, in harmony with the more mature girls and boys, laughs heartily at all late developers in order to convince them that what frightens them is basically completely natural. While every expression of the unexpressed, everything unhinged and all hesitation, in which the almost frightened individuality of the pupil could still express itself, is to be eradicated from their psychological organization as an anachronistic remnant of outdated conventions. Reform pedagogy develops an all the more perfidious interest in all remaining personal inclinations and in the details of the everyday lives of its subjects. This purpose is served by the Reform Pedagogical Friendship League, which takes the place of the organization based on the division of labor in state schools. Those who are teachers by profession have neither the right nor the need to interfere in the private or even intimate concerns of their pupils. In this respect, the separation of roles between pupils and teachers can, at least in the best case, be a step out of the compulsory family association. Those who are teachers by vocation, on the other hand, respect the private lives of their pupils just as little as their own. While they are still within their own four walls, they demonstrate lived responsibility for those whom they should actually leave in peace outside the school building, and even when they are at home, their pupils are still the subject of pedagogical manipulation. What they do outside of school tends to become even more important than their performance and their social behavior at school, as it is their everyday life outside of their social role as pupils that is supposed to reveal what they have really learned. The Reform Pedagogical School, which is simultaneously a learning, working, and living context, abolishes the division of roles not only in terms of the claim, but also empirically, by having all classmates and educators live together in families in a place from which they can never go home. Not only is the boundary between school and the private sphere liquidated, but the material authority of the teachers and the formal hierarchy resulting from it are liquidated at the same time. The necessarily unequal level of development of the pupils and the generational difference between them and the teachers are abolished in the practical experience of life. The total circle of friends that constitutes the Reform Pedagogical School as a social model is a sphere of lawless rule in which there is no defined authority, but also no solidarity, no respect, but also no freedom. Because everyone knows everything about each other and constantly huddles together in the name of the higher cause, literally no one can ever do anything bad to anyone. Only those who claim that something bad has been done to them by another member of the community are defined as evil, namely as incapable of community and irresponsible. According to this logic, the Odenwald students who avoided nude bathing or the friendly groping rituals were defamed as uptight eccentrics. However, according to the same logic, those responsible who had acted contrary to the spirit of the community are now pilloried by the former students. And they are all united against the real child abusers, the Catholics, who have the presumption to want to judge the cases of abuse in their own ranks according to canon law. The resentment with which this hubris is met by public opinion makes it clear what is really at stake: not the defense of state law against ecclesiastical law, but the defense of the law of the state against church and state. Hardly any article about the abuse at the Odenwald school has forgotten to complain that most cases are unfortunately time-barred and that many perpetrators have died. If they were still alive, they would rather be dead. The crude rules of conduct and the stale aesthetics of reform pedagogy make it easy to dismiss them as esoteric and old-fashioned from the perspective of a supposedly enlightened present. In fact, the retrospective reckoning with the apparent permissiveness in the Odenwald goes hand in hand with a broadly effective revival of reform pedagogical ideas. They have merely been given a neurophilosophical and communitarian makeover. What used to come across as a humanistic pedagogy of the whole person is now, draped in brain science, suggested to parents as a necessity for early childhood education. For example, when Mozart's string quartets are recommended as a neurophysiological learning aid for unborn babies, or the female body is conceptualized as a potential milieu and a maturation space that must be kept healthy and fresh at all costs in
The Name of the Unborn Child's Future.
In the course of the general enthusiasm for longer joint learning, for the dissolution of the multi-unit school system into comprehensive all-day schools, for school support measures by a whole enforcement staff of tutors, therapists, psychologists and counselors, for strengthening the rights of parents' associations, etc. The Reform Pedagogical Circle of Friends has long since established itself in the middle of society, where the former Reform pedagogues had not yet been able to establish themselves. And all of this is expected to make children fit for the future, not just for ideological reasons, but frighteningly enough for real. In reality, the practice of lifelong learning, as the postmodern version of the educational reform craze is called, is creating an army of self-confident infants, from kindergartens to multi-generational houses, from employment offices to further education coaching, who enthusiastically accept any coercion offered to them for the purpose of temporarily guaranteeing their own existence as part of their very own self-realization program. When the future for which they are preparing themselves has become reality, no teacher will be able to save them. Before the Bundestag debated the possibility of granting pregnant women prenatal blood tests for trisomy 21 as a health insurance benefit, the FDP parliamentary group published a tweet as a statement on the upcoming debate, which earned it accusations of moral neglect from the social media community. The demand trisomy 21 test must be covered by health insurance was illustrated with a photo showing a child with Down syndrome on its mother's lap. The accompanying text justified the demand as follows: every pregnant woman must be able to decide for herself and without discrimination whether and which tests she has carried out and how she deals with the result. A coalition of Christians and feminists, moralizers and diversity advocates, green and conservative pro-lifers immediately went into overdrive. Julia Klöckner, CDU, who as Federal Minister of Agriculture is apparently also responsible for breast milk distribution quotas, announced, "I can't believe that this FDP post is supposed to be real," with this child in the picture to make it clear that it might not be born with a trisomy 21 test if the test were covered by health insurance. That is why the FDP is in favor of non-discriminatory health insurance coverage. Christian Müller-Zurek from Lebenshilfe Berlin e.V. warned NTV, the FDP's tweet discriminates against people with Down syndrome and is actually fueling fear of disability.
End quote.
Her colleague Yvonne Cantor, herself the mother of a son with Down syndrome, demanded a clear yes to the diversity of human life from the Bundestag and saw a new Auschwitz dawning from afar. Today, people with Down syndrome are to be sorted out. Whose turn is it tomorrow?
End of quote.
In the cross-party and cross-party debate in the Bundestag, which followed after the FDP had already withdrawn its post as misleading, Kirsten Kappertgonder, Bündnis 90/Die Grünen, referred to Iceland, where prenatal testing for trisomy 21 is used across the board, which is unfortunately why hardly any children with Down syndrome are born there, and demanded, "This normal case must never be allowed to exist in Germany."
End of quote.
Families with children with Down syndrome, she believed, were just as happy or unhappy as other families. They did not suffer from the disability, but from the widespread hostility towards the disabled. Stefan Pilsinger, CDU/CSU, spoke out against a eugenic society in which designer babies would be the order of the day and, like Karina Ruffer of the Greens, feared a selection of unborn children. Dagmar Schmidt, SPD, warned of the economic interests of the manufacturers of such tests, and Catherine Vogler from the Left Party seconded that trisomy 21 blood tests are very popular because they are courted with the argument of high safety, and should therefore be more strictly regulated. Members of parliament from the FDP, AFD and Left Party in particular had noticed that the fact that the blood tests, which are already available to parents who pay for them out of their own pocket, would be financed by the health insurance system would initially eliminate discrimination against women with less financial means. Christine Eskenberg-Douglas, FDP, demanded that the financial situation should not be decisive for the decision on an abortion and stated that pregnant women have a right to know, as well as a right not to know with regard to the health of their child. Cornelia Moring from the Left Party pointed out that the fear of single mothers, in particular of economic and social isolation, was not based on mothers' prejudices against disability, but on the reality of life, and Axel Gerke, AFD, who defended the detection of anomalies as a legitimate need for information on the part of parents, warned against stylizing cash funding of the tests as the downfall of the West. The SPD health expert Karl Lauterbach was the most precise in his arguments in favor of health insurance funding, while the current prenatal testing procedure, in which a hollow needle is inserted into the amniotic sac via the abdominal wall and uterine wall, is riskier for the health of the woman and the child. The blood tests are not only extremely reliable, but also harmless to health, i.e., simply much better. It is therefore not justifiable to withhold them from economically disadvantaged parents. Rather, they should be made available to every woman, accompanied by counseling with an open mind. Irrespective of their position on the issue of health insurance funding, all the MPs were full of praise for the happiness of parenthood, the beauty of the world and the joy of life. Babies are definitely a wonderful gift. The colorful magic land out there is characterized by diversity, surprise, and also by the imperfect Claudia Schmidtke's CDU. Thank God we are all different and must accept that. Wilfried Ehlers, CDU/CSU. Motherhood is a reason for joy. Volkermans, AFD. Diversity and humanity are more important than efficiency. Cornelia Moring, Die Link. Apart from the question of whether critics who interpret the image posted by the FDP as a representation of a situation to be avoided and thus as a warning against trisomy 21 children, rather than a simple symbolic image, are not unacknowledgedly more afraid of disability than women who want a blood test. The question arises as to why no one is bothered by the chubby-cheeked contempt for humanity of people who want to persuade disabled people to accept their otherness according to the motto "You're not perfect, it's great," who routinely shrug their shoulders when it comes to the issue of aborting non-disabled fetuses, but immediately imagine themselves on the verge of the ramp when it comes to women who are not prepared to give birth to a trisomy 21 child, who, without blushing, regurgitate the phrase that performance is not everything, but demand that expectant mothers of disabled children, of all people, jump over their shadows and go through with it, and who also profess such habitual crudeness with a sausage-like formulation that every family is as happy or unhappy as the next anyway. Whether happy or unhappy, poor or rich, intellectual or stupid, human or inhuman, everyone who is in the world must enjoy life because it is impossible to imagine any other than the one that exists. In truth, this attitude, which presents itself as an expression of affirmation of life, is evidence of a practical contempt for life, at least if one is willing and able to understand life, not as an all-encompassing stream that brings forth and devours each individual, but as an individualized life that finds its purpose and destiny in the individual transient human being. The irrefutable fact that a life with a disability entails more difficulties for those affected and their environment than a life without, even in a disability-friendly society, and that the anti-ableist slogan "We are not disabled, we are disabled" has only ever been half the truth, and that therefore the conservationist yes to diversity, which of course includes a colorful range of disabilities, is just as cynical as the plea to preventively avoid any disability. All of this is only not. Notice, because everyone knows and no one wants to know that in the world from which trisomy 21 children are to be sorted out, diversity and humanity are extremely rare, and reasonable arguments for a love of life and parental happiness are correspondingly rare. Just because there is almost nothing outside that is worth going outside for, just because almost everyone closes the door on their own future by the time they come of age at the latest, only because the encounter with a free and therefore lovable person, which happens at best once every 15 years, is feared by the vast majority as the biggest accident to be expected in their own biography, only because the birth of a disabled child is celebrated as a very special surprise, while the non-disabled child is consigned to demographic replacement treatment without shame, complaint, or love. For the non-disabled, according to the contemptible logic underlying such double standards, will eventually become normal citizens anyway, while the disabled will always remain somehow different and therefore a living objection to normality, from which the normal by no means suffer without reason, but which is often enough desired by those stigmatized as abnormal for at least as good a reason. In order to gauge the diabolical extent of such a reversed politics of life, it is worth taking a look at the work of an Austrian nag who, in his dual function as a natural scientist and misanthropic philosopher, came across the contradictions of a misanthropic joie de vivre early on, which turns the correct insight that every life should be protected into a demagogic worldview, according to which life is more important than those who live. Erwin Chargaff, born in Czernowitz in 1905 as the son of Austro-Hungarian Jews, studied philology and chemistry in Vienna and worked in exile at Columbia University in New York from 1935, where he developed the so-called Chargaff rules on the basic composition of double-stranded DNA between 1952 and 1968. Since the late 1970s, he has published a series of volumes of essays and aphorisms, most of which have been published in German by Klett Cotta and deal with the concept of life in the natural sciences and its relationship to the sphere of the somatic in the tradition of the anthropological materialism of Arthur Schopenhauer, Karl Kraus, and the Italian poet and philosopher Guido Serenetti. defeatism, fatalism, and the conviction of the impregnability of nature and thus of human mortality, which are often cited as signs of Chargaff's hostility to progress, are in fact evidence of his loyalty to the accidental, transient and, for this very reason, ineradicable individual who can be measured by nothing but himself. This attitude leads Chargaff to a fundamental critique of genetics, pre-implantation diagnostics and prenatal medicine, which seems to be similar to the defenders of the right not to know with regard to possible disabilities in children, but differs from them in its strict refusal to affirm congenital suffering as a life-friendly enrichment. An interview conducted with Chargaff in 2001, a year before his death, illustrates the two-faced nature of his critique of civilization, which on the one hand stylizes scientific and medical progress as a context of catastrophe, believes that every doctor is a potential concentration camp accomplice and condemns every attempt to control human life with technology as a sin, but on the other hand does not refrain from denouncing the blind rule of first nature as anti-human and tirelessly mocks the conviction that human happiness consists of living in accordance with it. Chargaff's polemical misanthropy thus reveals a philanthropy that the loquacious defenders of diversity and variety, who speak of disabled life, instead of the lives of the disabled, lack. However, it is easy to accuse Chargaff of making inappropriate generalizations. For him, attempts to genetically manipulate human life and messing around with embryos are crimes. Scientists and doctors are crooked puffery, who are waging a war against nature. Since Hiroshima, natural science has been a science of death. He calls its protagonists the Taliban of modernity. He accuses molecular biologist James Watson, who proclaimed that the fate of mankind lies in the genes rather than in the stars, of striving to breed the superhuman, and he accuses pre-implantation diagnostics of wanting to select healthy and sick life from one another like an improved Hitler. Progress, he says, is an unstoppable horror. Scientific researchers and doctors are believed as unconditionally as shamans used to be. For Chargaff, who calls not knowing a grace and uncertainty the salt of life, expectant mothers who decide against or in favor of having a child with trisomy 21 on the basis of medically acquired prior knowledge are acting like life breeders on the ramp. Although Chargaff's comments are similar to the warnings against designer babies and the sorting out of embryos, right down to the choice of words, his stance is incompatible with diversity propaganda that morally blackmails expectant mothers in the name of diversity of human life to refrain from terminating a pregnancy if the child is potentially disabled, or brazenly insinuates that families with disabled children are as happy or unhappy as everyone else. He takes the concept of happiness and suffering too seriously for that. For Chargaff, the negativity of the existing and its reflection in bodily experience, which are anathema to propagandists of prenatal diversity, rather form the starting point for his criticism of a scientific medical optimism that claims that everything is fixable. He responds to this with a plea for a social practice that respects the irreparable in its negativity and difficulty and seeks to remedy it instead of denying or even affirming it. When he complains, "I can hardly go to the toilet on my own, I'm limping on a stick, that's not a condition, I should disappear. I'm like a chicken that no longer lays eggs. I'm fed up with life, my spine hurts all the time," only to immediately complain that today's doctors would rather install a new spine than construct a comfortable chair. He is not pleading for euthanasia, but rather opposing an ideal of the longest possible life, which has lost any qualitative definition of life, which may be long in other words, against the replacement of talk of the unrepeatable individual life with life, from which the individual emerges in order to merge back into it. And when Chargaff follows the diagnosis humanity has come to an end with the sentence nature simply goes on, he makes it clear that the end of humanity does not simply stem from the victory of technology and medicine, but from the unresolved compulsion of nature, which is blindly repeated in human practice, that in inverted human conditions nature, despite all the advances of science and medicine, is still that which passes over people instead of happily connecting with them. If Chargaff's seemingly inhuman defeatism owes itself to the effort to defend the individuals who live against life, the diversity-enthusiastic defense of the diversity of human life against the selfish desires of the living expresses the need to swear the living to life, while they are still in a state of formal maturity. The extent to which this need gets in the way of intellectual consistency is shown by the fact that feminists, for whom ordinary fetuses are clumps of cells that can be scratched out, and newly Catholic mutated anti-Germans, who still rant about the individual at every opportunity, suddenly find themselves in agreement. An example of the first type is Kirsten Achterlich, who in her book Selbstbestimmt Norm, Self-Determined Norm, defames the compulsory counseling provided before an abortion, which is supposed to satisfy the need to weigh up the rights of the unborn child and the pregnant woman, as compulsory counseling in the bad feminist tradition. But on the other hand, whenever she discusses the possibilities of prenatal diagnostics, especially in connection with the early detection of disabilities, she immediately switches from abortion propaganda to moral coercion. It sounds like this: when people are pregnant and want to have a child, there are many prenatal examinations, prenatal diagnostics. This has now become a normal procedure as part of the preventive medical checkups for pregnant women, which more and more people are taking up as a matter of course. Some of these examinations are important and necessary to ensure that the pregnant woman and the child-to-be are well and healthy. However, most examinations look for possible disabilities and abnormalities in the fetus. These examinations create a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety for those affected. If a fetal disability is detected, there is usually nothing that can be done to make the pregnant woman and her future child feel better. It can be useful to know about certain disabilities in preparation for the birth. However, after a diagnosis, the pregnant woman is often faced with a decision of whether she wants to have the child anyway, or whether she wants to have an abortion because of it.
End of quote.
According to these explanations, prenatal examinations are basically always something that cannot be taken for granted because they are technical. They manipulate the woman's self-relationship in accordance with social norms and are only used as a matter of course due to the internalization of such norms. The fact that the fear of giving birth to a disabled child, which arises from insecurity, can also be remedied by a prenatal examination, that the search for disabilities and deviations of the fetus can benefit the health of the pregnant woman and thus the child, is not taken into consideration. On the contrary, it is assumed without empirical evidence that it is the examinations themselves that create uncertainty and fear. Why the weighing up of one's own right to self-determination and the right of the unborn child, which every woman faced with a decision to have an abortion must and does undertake, even if she denies it, should be fundamentally more precarious in the case of a disabled child than in the case of a healthy one, is not explained. Instead, the woman whose claim to the right to abortion is otherwise only proclaimed rather than justified, is suspected of being susceptible to indoctrination in the case of a possibly disabled child, indeed of being a potential exterminator of life unworthy of life. Thus the pregnant woman who does not trust herself or simply refuses to give birth to a disabled child is lectured by Actalic with ice-cold philanthropy. Quote, disability is still often associated with worry, suffering and pain, a dismissive and anti-disability attitude. The social provision of resources for the targeted prenatal search for abnormalities and disabilities, via regular funding by health insurance companies, shows that it is still considered normal and unproblematic to want to avoid disability at almost any cost. Conventional ideas of disability follow a medical individualistic model of disability. This socially dominated image of disability makes it difficult to imagine that a child could have a very good life if it were born with a disability.
End of quote.
The final formula, which reduces the demand for a good life for all to the stale consolation that disabled people will somehow manage without perishing, shows how much resignation, conformism and callousness there is in all this thickly applied empowerment. Because no one wants to know that disabled people suffer not only from society but also from their disability, the decision to abort a disabled fetus is turned into the avoidance of disability at almost any price, i.e. the willingness to euthanize, and the standard funding by health insurance companies is criticized through the veneer, which is of course still gladly claimed in the case of the abortion of normal fetuses. If feminism falls victim to the moralism that has been part of it from the beginning, anti-German young men become so categorical in the face of what they consider to be the demand for an improvement in the euthanization of disabled people in the womb, that even Monty Python can no longer be used against them. On the Facebook page Ideologie Kritisch Action, which is not above using shared postings of before and after pictures of supposed feminists to demonstrate that female emancipation makes women fat, ugly and neglected, a Mr. Nameless is outraged after receiving opposition to his criticism of the FDP demand. I also didn't realize that so many people here want to discuss the question of human life in purely technical or biologistic terms. In this respect, the devastation caused by the end of Christianity in Europe seems more serious than one might think, especially as it seems to have been replaced by a purely instrumental ethic rather than an enlightened one. He immediately threatens condomization. The question of where human life begins and whether every sperm should be sacred must be addressed. With the end of Christianity, they no longer do so when it comes to defending the question of human life against the purely technical and purely instrumental thinking of women, whose living conditions or simply their rational egoism block their view of the fact that they are not just individual human beings, but fertile ground for sacred seeds. Although one is still prepared to concede that the decision for or against an abortion, even in the case of a possibly handicapped child, must be the result of a weighing up on the part of the woman, that is what the Bahamas said, and what it says is true, it is nevertheless assumed that anyone who decides against the child as a result of such weighing up is denying viable but handicapped children the right to life, and declaring them to be a mere burden. The fact that the born child originates from the unborn child, which is why the unborn child must also be considered a legal person, but that the adult woman differs from the unborn child in that she is the bearer of civil rights and that the decision about what she does with her body must not be taken away from her by self-appointed moral philosophers. Such trifles must be put aside when it comes to the defense not of living people, but of human life. The fact that abortions at the request of the pregnant woman and with the completion of counseling up to the 12th week of pregnancy generally remain exempt from punishment is also due to the effort to preserve the blurred boundary between late abortion and premature birth in the sense of defending the personal status of the unborn child against the personal rights of the pregnant woman. With the help of the blood tests promoted by the FDP in its post, trisomy 21 can be diagnosed in unborn babies from the 9th week of pregnancy onwards. The medical recommendation is to wait until the 11th week. In this case, the pregnant woman has certainty about the test result a good week later, whereas with the invasive method, which has so far only been financed by health insurance, she usually has to wait until the 18th week of pregnancy. Although abortions in the case of a trisomy 21 diagnosis are regulated according to medical indication anyway, and therefore late abortions are possible without punishment. The blood test as a diagnostic tool therefore facilitates an abortion within the time frame provided for normal abortions and should therefore be defended by people who are skeptical about the legal expansion of the possibility of late abortions. The fact that this does not happen, and that the general reservation against abortions of fetuses with diagnosed disabilities is formulated even stricter in the case of the blood test than against the invasive test variant, indicates that moral criteria have gained the upper hand, not because of the time and circumstances of the abortion, but because of the quality of the developing life in question. Whereas in the abortion of a normal fetus, people are far more willing to defend the woman's judgment and decision-making capacity over the right of the unborn child, in the discussion about abortions of disabled fetuses, the unborn child is accorded a stronger subject status, as if in symbolic compensation for its infirmity, than the mother, who instead of being a subject capable of judgment, appears more as a potential perpetrator who is in danger of abusing her subject status to harm the
unborn child.
The tendency to view advances in prenatal diagnostics as a threat to a woman's autonomy rather than as a strengthening of her decision-making capacity is exemplified in Barbara Duden's study Der Frauenleib als öffentlicher Ort, The Woman's Body as a Public Place, which is of greater interest than the admonitions of Kirsten Achterlich because it explicitly criticizes the hypostasis of life as a supra-individual concept that means more than the life of the individual. As life no longer denotes the bodily experience linked to the individual, but rather a process in which this experience is extinguished, namely organizational stages of chromosomes and tissues that can only be verified under laboratory conditions, in that a concept of life gained from the natural sciences is thus set as a moral, philosophical, legal, and political category, the talk of life, instead of being conducive to knowledge, threatens to become a medium of deception and
delusion.
However, instead of developing the relationship between the scientific, medical, legal, and philosophical concept of life and its genesis, Duden assumes that the state, church, and medicine, when they speak of life, ultimately presuppose interchangeable concepts of life in their abstractness and thus skip over the sphere of bodily experience, which is decisive for the assessment of pregnancy. In this respect, she interprets all tendencies to generalize and codify the concept of life negatively. Quote, the Bundestag assumes the mandate to regulate the rights of subjects for whose existence there can be no eyewitnesses in the legal sense. The Church, whose knowledge of the human being comes from revelation and not from natural science, acts as the guardian of these unbaptized human cell clusters. The mission of the doctor, which consisted in alleviating the suffering of persons, from their birth to their death, is extended by a new medical ethic to the management of human genetic matter. It seems as if science had always sought the emergence of a life, as if the medical profession had always claimed the unborn as patients, as if legislators had for hundreds of years wanted to protect life in the womb, and not sons, recruits, servants, heirs, as if the Church had always equated human existence with life.
End quote.
While it is certainly true that changes in science, medicine, and law tend to forget their genesis and set themselves up as immediately valid, this approach ignores the progressive aspect of all abstraction in favor of a Foucauldian fetishization of the immediate, the preconceptual. It is not only in relation to the human fetus that talk of law aims at something for which there can be no eyewitnesses. Rather, the title of legal person also refers to something necessarily assumed in relation to born human beings, the fictional part of which, that it cannot be empirically verified, is precisely what makes it true. Even to set the unborn as a legal person is not due to a hypostatization of the scientific concept of life, but to the consequent universalization of the concept of the legal person itself. In a very similar way, the demand for the protection of unborn life, insofar as the Church still adheres to it at all, is derived from the concept of creation, which at best finds its inadequate illustration, but not its foundation in unbaptized human cell clusters. Finally, for a crude positivism, the physician's mission is only limited to the time between birth and the hour of death, but from antiquity to the present has always encompassed the regulation of the transitions between life and death. Because it skips over such mediations and juxtaposes the moment of abstraction in natural science, medicine and law with the bodily experience as a benchmark, prenatal diagnostics is for Duden a form of manipulation that inscribes the concept of life into the female body. The fact that it can also serve to strengthen the individual woman against heteronomy and incapacitation does not occur to her. Thus, ultrasound turns the woman's body into a showcase, and prenatal diagnostics turn the unborn child into a public fetus, a legal fiction in the abdomen. Contrary to the title thesis of Duden's book, Duden does not ask whether the woman's womb threatens to become a public place precisely because the woman is deprived of the possibility of better knowledge and control of her first nature given by ultrasound or blood tests in order to hand her over to her bodily experience. Whether those who deny the law its fictional moment do not hand over the legal subjects to immediate violence all the more, just as little as the pro-lifers she criticizes, who play off human life against the living. If we look at the medical criticism of the outlawing of the abortion of unborn children with a trisomy 21 diagnosis from the perspective of Chargaff's negative anthropology, the admonitions for the special protection of disabled life appear less as a criticism of an instrumental and therefore inhumane ethic than as part of an anti-human welfare offensive that takes sides with life, primarily in order to keep the individual living person helpless and therefore in need of protection in the
long term.
The fact that children with Down syndrome play such a prominent role in this discussion seems to have to do with precisely this need. Trisomy 21 usually manifests itself as a mixed form of physical and mental disability, which can also be accompanied by sensory impairments such as hearing loss, impaired self-perception, and a weakened immune system. Nevertheless, with appropriate care and education, those affected can generally lead an independent life as adults. Thanks to better medical and therapeutic treatment methods, the average life expectancy of people with trisomy 21 has risen from 9 years in 1929 to 60 years today. At the same time, doctors and parents of those affected emphasize that people with Down syndrome appear gentler, more receptive, and calmer than their peers without disabilities due to their limited ability to express emotions and their slower reaction time. In addition, they have clear strengths in social functioning and are less demanding than other children of the same age. The history of dealing with Down syndrome in particular illustrates that disability is not simply fate, but can be changed by the way society deals with it. In addition to the social history, which tells of the embedding of disability in institutional and everyday contexts, there is also an imaginary history of disability, which has no less and often fatal effects on its reality. Down syndrome plays a prominent role in this, not least because it symbolizes the coincidence of neediness and harmlessness that all care and thus all social domination desires from the object of its attention. Neither hopeless cases nor aggressive cripples, people with Down syndrome seem to be, in a particularly conspicuous way, what the unspoken wish of passionate care apostles is that all people should be, adults who have remained children, who are able to maintain themselves, but for this purpose require constant attention from self-declared guardians whom they love, harmless and in need of help, with limited maturity and therefore harmless. According to this imagination, mothers who do not want such a child vote imperiously and egotistically against the morally camouflaged alliance of harmlessness and domination, gentleness and violence, and against a demanding caring attitude that only loves people when there is no need to fear their freedom. But as I said, this is an imagination that does not coincide with the reality of disability. If those who, in the opinion of caring pro-lifers, embody disabled life, were to escape their condemnation to harmlessness with the same consistency as women escape their prescribed commitment to life, by all equally rejecting the care imposed on them by blackmail, then something could really change in the relationship between disability and normality.